In 1931, archaeologist Eric Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania Museum arrived at Tel Farah in southern Iraq with a straightforward excavation mandate to continue documenting the remains of the ancient Sumerian city that tradition unanimously identified as Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero. What his team encountered as they cut through the occupation levels of the site did not align with any straightforward archaeological expectation. At a specific depth, the cultural debris of a fully functioning urban civilization, pottery, administrative seals, cuneiform fragments, craft tools and architectural remains, terminated with geological abruptness against a band of clean, sterile, water-deposited clay. No gradual decline, no transitional layer, no evidence of fire, abandonment, or gradual social collapse. The civilization was present, and then the water arrived, and then the civilization was gone. Below the flood deposit, the tablets that had been sealed in the earth since the moment the water rose preserved a record that has never been fully reckoned with. That record is not what anyone expected to find beneath a catastrophic flood layer. It is not fragmentary, it is not primitive, it is not desperate. The cuneiform tablets recovered from beneath Mesopotamian flood deposits at Shuruppak, Nippur, Eridu, and reveal a civilization operating at full administrative, intellectual, and technical capacity on the day the water arrived, producing medical codices, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, legal documents, agricultural manuals, and genealogical records with the professional confidence of an institution that had been doing exactly this work for centuries and expected to continue doing it indefinitely. And woven through this archive of ordinary institutional productivity, visible only when the corpus is examined as a whole rather than as isolated fragments, is something more unsettling. Evidence that certain scribes knew the water was coming, understood what it would destroy, and made specific choices about what knowledge would need to survive it. The investigation that follows examines what those choices were, why they were made, and what the physical, geological, and textual evidence reveals about the final hours of the civilization that ended when the flood arrived. If the conclusions this evidence supports challenge what you believed about the origins of human knowledge and the trajectory of ancient civilization, consider following this investigation further as we continue examining what the oldest archive in human history was designed to tell us. The evidence we are about to examine spans the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the sediment layers of southern Iraq, the underwater ruins of drowned cities, the astronomical calculations of a civilization that could see its own end approaching, and the extraordinary archival intelligence of scribes who understood that they were writing not for their contemporaries, but for whoever would eventually dig through the layers of catastrophe and find what they had left behind. In the summer of 1902, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey arrived at the mound of Tel Farah in the Babylonian plain of southern Iraq and began the first systematic excavation of the site that ancient Mesopotamian tradition identified as Shuruppak, the city from which the flood hero had sailed. Koldewey's preliminary work, continued by Friedrich Delitzsch and later expanded by Eric Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania between 1931 and 1932, established a stratigraphic sequence that has never been fully explained within conventional archaeological models of Mesopotamian development. The excavations revealed a precise sedimentary boundary separating two distinct periods of human occupation, with a band of clean, water-deposited clay sandwiched between them at a depth and uniformity that geological analysis confirmed was consistent with rapid, massive inundation rather than gradual riverine flooding. The cultural material below this boundary, catalogued across institutions including the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, includes administrative tablets, mathematical texts, craft instruction documents, and literary fragments that display a level of institutional sophistication no conventional model of Mesopotamian development had prepared scholars to find at that stratigraphic position, and that continue, more than a century after their discovery, to generate questions that mainstream archaeology has not satisfactorily answered. The flood layer at Tel Farah was not an isolated geological anomaly. When Leonard Woolley's team encountered a virtually identical stratum at in 1929, a band of sterile, water-laid clay measuring 2.5 meters in thickness containing no cultural material of any kind. The correlation between the two sites established something that geologist Max Mallowan confirmed during his systematic analysis of sediment deposits across southern Mesopotamia in the 1930s. The flooding event responsible for these deposits was not a localized river inundation, but a regional catastrophe operating at a scale that normal hydraulic behavior cannot explain. The Tel Farah flood deposit, when analyzed against the stratum and comparable layers subsequently identified at Kish, Lagash, and Nippur, revealed a pattern of sedimentary uniformity that pointed not toward periodic riverine flooding, which leaves characteristic lamination sequences and organic debris distributed across multiple depositional events, but toward a single sustained inundation of extraordinary magnitude, depositing a homogeneous clay layer across hundreds of square kilometers within a compressed geological timeframe. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, operating within any parameters consistent with their documented historical behavior, could not have produced this deposit. Something larger was responsible, and its consequences for the civilization whose final documents lay sealed beneath it were absolute and immediate. What Schmidt's team recovered from beneath this boundary at Tel Farah constitutes the interpretive challenge that makes the site so significant. The tablets, architectural remains, and material culture recovered from the pre-flood strata do not display the characteristics that archaeologists expect to find in an early settlement gradually evolving toward urban complexity. They display the characteristics of a mature urban administrative system operating with institutional confidence. The Far Prefix tablet collection recovered by the German Orient Society and now distributed between the Vorderasiatisches Museum and the Free University of Berlin, includes administrative documents employing a standardized accounting vocabulary, consistent symbolic conventions, and mathematical notation systems that demonstrate the established protocols of a bureaucratic tradition that had already undergone its developmental phase before these particular tablets were produced. The pottery from the pre-flood levels at Tel Farah, analysed by Schmidt against ceramic sequences from other southern Mesopotamian sites, belongs to the late Ubaid and early Uruk transitional horizon, placing it somewhere in the range of 3200 to 2900 BC, earlier than the period in which the level of administrative sophistication the tablets display is conventionally considered to have been possible. The absence of a developmental sequence in the Tel Farah stratigraphic record is the feature that conventional Mesopotamian scholarship has most consistently struggled to accommodate. A civilization developing naturally toward urban administrative complexity leaves behind archaeological evidence of that development. Increasingly sophisticated pottery transitioning through recognizable stylistic stages, tool industries showing progressive refinement from cruder to more precise forms, administrative documents moving from simple pictographic tallies toward fully developed script. The pre-flood levels at Tel Farah do not display this progression, with the clarity that the model requires. The earliest cultural material recoverable from beneath the flood layer displays administrative and technical sophistication that appears in the record without adequate antecedents. This pattern extends beyond Tel Farah. Fuad Safar's excavations at Eridu between 1946 and 1949 revealed 17 distinct building levels, with the deepest architectural remains displaying engineering knowledge that appeared, in Safar's own published assessment, to emerge without the developmental intermediates that conventional models of ancient architectural evolution require. The buildings at Eridu's lowest levels are not crude, they are precise, and the tablets associated with the earliest Tel Farah levels are not primitive, they are institutional. The civilization that produced them had been a civilization for a very long time before the moment its record was sealed beneath the flood. The tablets sealed beneath the flood deposit at Shuruppak represent the final documented output of this institutional system, and among them, one document stands apart from the administrative records and mathematical exercises, not merely for what it contains, but for who it was addressed to, and what that address implies about what its author understood was approaching. Among all the cuneiform documents recovered from Mesopotamian sites, and dated to the period immediately predating the Great Flood deposits, none carries more weight or presents more interpretive challenge than the text known to scholars as the Instructions of Shuruppak, preserved across more than 20 individual tablet fragments spanning multiple sites, periods, and collections, with the most significant fragments catalogued under designation CBS 11379 in the Penn Museum collection, and parallel versions distributed across holdings in Berlin, Istanbul, and Baghdad. The text presents itself as the direct wisdom address of a ruler named Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra, the figure identified across every major Mesopotamian flood tradition as the survivor of the Great Deluge, and scholars have generally treated it as a piece of early wisdom literature comparable to Egyptian instructional texts or the Hebrew Book of Proverbs. But a careful reading of the instructions against the backdrop of the full pre-flood archival corpus reveals something the literary classification obscures. This is not a philosophical meditation composed at leisure. The language shifts at specific moments from general ethical guidance into urgent, compressed, practically specific knowledge transmission. The kind of condensed technical communication written by someone who understood that the world his reader would inherit would be fundamentally different from the world in which the document was composed, and who was racing against a deadline that was not administrative but geological. Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, who produced the first comprehensive scholarly treatment of the Instructions of Shuruppak in 1956, categorized the text primarily within the tradition of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, a reasonable classification for a document whose surface structure consists largely of ethical maxims, behavioral guidance, and practical proverbs about social conduct. Bent Ulster's more detailed analysis, published in 1974, which collated all known fragment variants and established the most complete critical edition of the text then available to scholarship, similarly emphasized its literary and pedagogical dimensions while acknowledging certain passages that resist straightforward wisdom literature classification. What neither Kramer nor Ulster examined with sustained attention was the relationship between the instruction's content and the specific archival context in which its primary fragments were preserved. The fact that this document was not merely a literary text circulating in the general scribble tradition, but a document found in sealed contexts associated with the deliberate preservation effort visible across the Tel Farah and Nippur archival deposits, Examined within that context, the instructions of Shuruppak reads differently than it does as an isolated literary text, and the difference is significant. The structure of the instructions, when examined closely, reveals a document operating on two levels simultaneously. The ethical surface follows the conventions of Mesopotamian wisdom literature sufficiently closely to have been classified within that tradition without difficulty: advice against dishonest dealing, guidance on proper social conduct, warnings about the consequences of arrogance, recommendations for the management of household and agricultural affairs. But beneath this surface, threading through the text at irregular intervals that do not follow the wisdom literature template, a different kind of communication emerges. Specific passages shift from the third-person ethical generalization characteristic of instructional proverbs to direct second-person instruction with a technical precision and urgency that the wisdom literature frame does not adequately account for. Agricultural knowledge encoded within proverbs about proper conduct, hydraulic information embedded within metaphors about the management of water, astronomical timing guidance framed as advice about propitious seasons for undertaking major projects. The compression of this material and the specific domains it covers, agriculture, hydraulics, astronomy, metallurgy, social organization, correspond precisely to the domains of technical knowledge systematically preserved across the broader pre-flood archival record at Tel Farah and Nippur. The document's repeated address to Ziusudra, the flood hero, the man chosen to survive, takes on an entirely different significance when examined from this perspective. The instructions of Shuruppak is not, on this reading, simply a father's philosophical bequest to a beloved son. It is a compressed technical inheritance deliberately packaged within a literary framework that would ensure its survival and transmission even if the specifically technical knowledge it encoded was not immediately recognized as such by those who copied and preserved it across subsequent generations. A document that reads as a collection of ethical proverbs will survive the religious and political transformations that would destroy a document that reads as an engineering manual. A document addressed as personal wisdom from a father to a son will be preserved by cultural reverence and family loyalty in circumstances that would lead to the loss of an administrative technical archive. The literary frame of the instructions of Shuruppak was itself a preservation technology. The outer shell of a document designed to protect its technical contents through the cultural discontinuities that its author understood were coming, and the identity of the recipient, the man who would build the vessel and survive the deluge, tells us with uncomfortable clarity that those discontinuities were not hypothetical in the mind of the document's author. The institution that produced the instructions of Shuruppak and the broader pre-flood archival record was not a random collection of literate individuals operating under ordinary administrative mandate. It was a highly organized, rigorously trained, and institutionally coherent body of specialists whose entire educational formation shaped both the content and the format of everything they produced, and whose curriculum contained within it the explicit understanding that what they were doing had been done before. The cuneiform tablets recovered from beneath Mesopotamian flood layers represent an institutional output, not an individual one, and the institution that produced them, the Aduba, or tablet house, whose physical remains have been excavated at Nippur, Ur, and Lagash, in the form of bench schoolrooms, model text tablets, and curriculum exercises, constitutes one of the most sophisticated formal educational systems the ancient world produced. The question of who was operating these scribal schools in the final days before catastrophe, and under what institutional mandate they were generating the extraordinary archival record that now lies beneath the flood deposits, becomes urgent when the content of the tablets is examined against the organizational requirements necessary to produce it. Fragments from the Nippur collection, including the school tablets designated as NT 456 and NT 892 in the Penn Museum archive, document a curriculum that extended far beyond the mechanical production of cuneiform symbols to encompass advanced mathematics, systematic astronomical observation, medical theory, legal principle, and what the tablets themselves describe in a phrase that has not received adequate scholarly attention as the wisdom of the days before the flood, a formulation that appears repeatedly enough across the scribal curriculum to suggest that even within the pre-flood period, Mesopotamian scribal culture understood itself as preserving a knowledge tradition that predated and superseded its own civilization. The physical evidence for the Edubba system, documented comprehensively in Niekveldhuis's 1997 study of the Nippur scribal curriculum, consists of more than literary texts and administrative exercises. Benched schoolrooms excavated at Nippur and retain the physical traces of pedagogical activity across centuries. The wear patterns on clay benches where student scribes sat for years of intensive training, the discard piles of failed exercises buried beneath occupation floors, the master teacher's demonstration tablets showing correct sign formation alongside student attempts, showing progressive correction across multiple practice iterations. The institution was physically present in the buildings and the debris of the sites where it operated, and its curriculum was anything but elementary. The sign list tablets that form the earliest stage of scribal education, documents teaching systematic recognition and production of cuneiform signs in standardized sequence, were followed by mathematical training encompassing multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, area calculation methods, and volume computations that a modern engineering student would recognize as professionally relevant content. These were followed in turn by literary texts, astronomical observation records, medical theory documents, and legal formularies that together constituted what the Mesopotamian scribal tradition explicitly described as the complete inheritance of the Edubba, the totality of knowledge that a fully trained scribe was expected to have mastered before assuming professional responsibilities. The training duration implied by this curriculum was substantial by any measure. The progression from basic sign recognition through advanced mathematical computation, systematic astronomical observation methodology, medical diagnostics and pharmacology, legal drafting and literary composition, each stage requiring demonstrated mastery before advancement was permitted, suggests a minimum training period of 10 to 15 years for the most comprehensively educated scribes. The social implications of this investment are significant and have not been adequately examined in the literature. A civilization that trains specialists for 15 years to master medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, and literary tradition is not merely staffing an administrative apparatus with functionally literate bureaucrats. It is maintaining a knowledge institution whose function extends substantially beyond the operational needs of any single generation's administrative requirements, and whose educational scope makes no economic sense unless the knowledge being preserved is understood to have value that transcends immediate administrative utility. The phrase that appears across multiple Nippur curriculum tablets, the wisdom of the days before the flood, has been noted by scholars including Kramer and more recently by Piotr Michalowski of the University of Michigan in his work on Sumerian literary tradition, but its implications have not been drawn out with the thoroughness the evidence warrants. This phrase does not appear in isolation. it appears in contexts that explicitly frame the curriculum itself as the preservation and transmission of earlier wisdom, as if the scribal schools of Shuruppak and Nippur understood their educational mandate not as the creation of new knowledge for their own civilization's advancement, but as the stewardship of knowledge that predated their civilization and had survived a previous catastrophe. The Eduba, in its own internal self-description, was not merely a school. It was a custodial institution, and in the final period before the flood deposit seals its records in time, it was operating with the urgency of a custodial institution that understood, with whatever clarity its institutional tradition had preserved, what kind of catastrophe its accumulated knowledge was designed to outlast. The documents these institutions were producing in their final operational days cover every domain of technical knowledge that the subsequent flood would destroy. But the character of those documents, the precise tone in which they were composed, the format in which they were preserved, and the architectural context in which they were found, reveals something beyond ordinary institutional output. Among the most striking and least discussed features of the pre-flood tablet record is not what it says about catastrophe, warning, or survival, but what it reveals about routine. The administrative tablets recovered from beneath the flood deposits at Shuruppak, Eridu, and document a civilization engaged in the unremarkable daily business of urban governance, recording grain allocations, logging labor assignments, tracking livestock inventories, documenting property transfers, and maintaining the bureaucratic infrastructure of complex city administration. With no observable disruption in format, no compression of standard procedures, no abbreviation of the careful double-entry accounting that characterized Sumerian administrative practice across centuries, the ration lists from the Shuruppak archive, included within the Berlin Museum's FR prefix collection, recovered by the German Orient Society in the early 20th century, show consistent allocation records produced in the identical administrative format used decades earlier, with standard month notations, supervisor signatures, and commodity classifications maintained with the professional precision of an institution that anticipated producing identical documents the following week. The administrative record of a civilization ends at the flood layer not with chaos, not with emergency notation, not with abbreviated or desperate documentation, but with a perfectly ordinary day's paperwork, a detail whose implications for our understanding of what the scribes knew and when they knew it remain almost entirely unexplored. The specific content of these final administrative documents deserves careful attention that the scholarship has not consistently provided. The grain allocation records from Tel Farah's pre-flood levels document ration distributions calibrated to standard workforce categories. Adult male workers receiving standard barley allocations measured in specific silo units, supervisory personnel receiving proportionally larger distributions, dependent populations documented at reduced rates consistent with Sumerian administrative convention across multiple sites and periods. All of this recorded with the systematic precision of a bureaucratic apparatus operating fully within normal parameters. The livestock inventories from the same deposit level document seasonal herd compositions consistent with normal pasture rotation rather than emergency concentration or dispersal. The labor assignment documents project work responsibilities forward across a standard monthly accounting period. None of these documents, taken individually or collectively, display the characteristics that emergency documentation universally exhibits in every culture that has left such records: compressed notation, elimination of non-essential data fields, abandonment of standard formatting protocols, abbreviation of titles and institutional identifiers, urgency markers in the administrative vocabulary. The scribes who produced the final administrative archive of Shuruppak were either completely unaware that catastrophic flooding was imminent, or they were maintaining institutional routine with the disciplined professionalism that operated in full awareness of what was approaching. The archaeological evidence provides grounds for examining the second interpretation with considerably more seriousness than it has received. Among the administrative records recovered from the Tel Farah flood strata, a specific subset of documents was discovered in archaeological contexts that distinguished them materially from the ordinary deposition associated with administrative archives in active operational use. These tablets, found in sealed clay vessels, enclosed in bitumen-lined containers, or positioned in deliberate subfloor contexts beneath what had been the occupation surfaces of institutional buildings, were not the ordinary output of a functioning administrative system waiting to be retrieved for operational reference. They were prepared for long-term preservation by someone who did not expect to retrieve them personally. The administrative content of these sealed documents is not qualitatively different from the routine documents found in ordinary contexts at the same stratigraphic level. The same categories of ration lists, labour assignments, and livestock records appear in both ordinary and sealed contexts, but the physical treatment of the sealed documents, the deliberate protective packaging, the choice of preservation materials including bitumen, specifically for its waterproof properties, the subfloor placement in contexts designed to be structurally protected against surface disturbance, indicates that at some point in the final operational period of Shuruppak's administrative institutions, a decision was made to preserve specific documents not for retrieval by their authors, but for discovery by someone else, under circumstances that their protective packaging was designed to survive. This coexistence of ordinary administrative routine and deliberate archival preservation within the same archaeological deposit is one of the most revealing features of the pre-flood record. It suggests an institutional culture operating simultaneously on two levels, fulfilling its normal operational function and executing a parallel preservation mandate whose activation did not interrupt or visibly disrupt the surface routine of institutional life. Such dual operation is coherent only if the institutional structure had built into it the capacity to pursue both functions simultaneously, as both a functioning administrative system and a knowledge preservation mechanism whose full activation was contingent on circumstances that the institution's founding design had anticipated and prepared for. The last day's administrative output at Shuruppak looks ordinary because ordinary output was part of the plan. The sealed archive beneath the floor was the other part, and running through both the routine and the preserved records alike, in domains whose practical importance to any recovering civilization is self-evident, was a body of technical content representing the most deliberate act of intellectual custodianship in the archaeological record. The medical tablets embedded within the pre-flood archival record of Mesopotamian civilization represent one of the most technically sophisticated and chronologically anomalous bodies of knowledge to survive from the ancient world, and their systematic preservation beneath flood deposit layers raises questions that conventional medical history has no adequate framework to address. Tablets from the Nippur collection, including those designated NBC 4521 and CBS 1422 in the Penn Museum catalogue, preserve detailed descriptions of surgical interventions, wound management protocols, antiseptic preparation procedures, and pharmacological compound formulations that demonstrate understanding of human anatomy and infection dynamics far exceeding what scholars attribute to their period. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, Egypt's celebrated surgical document discovered by Edwin Smith in 1862 in Luxor and translated by James Henry Breasted in 1930, is routinely described in medical history literature as the oldest known systematic surgical text. Yet the Mesopotamian medical tablets that predate it by over 1,000 years, several recovered from below verified flood deposit layers, contain procedural detail approaching the Egyptian document in sophistication, while demonstrating independent derivation from a shared theoretical foundation that neither civilization appears to have developed through gradual clinical accumulation. The presence of cataract removal protocols, trepanation procedures, and compound pharmaceutical preparations in the pre-flood archival record suggests that medical knowledge of a quality typically attributed to much later periods was not merely available in antediluvian Mesopotamia, but was considered important enough to be systematically preserved in the final archive. The specific medical procedures documented in the pre-flood Nippur tablets challenge the timeline that conventional medical history has established for the development of systematic surgical practice in ways that individual tablet analysis alone cannot fully convey. But that become apparent when the tablets are examined as a coherent corpus within their archival context. The trepanation procedure described in fragments from the CBS series at the Penn Museum specifies not merely that the skull is to be opened, but provides detailed guidance about the precise anatomical location and diameter of the opening, the instruments required for cutting and clearing bone material without causing secondary damage, the management of bleeding during the procedure through specific compound applications, the post-operative preparations to be applied to the wound site, and the clinical monitoring criteria by which the attending physician could assess recovery progress or identify the onset of complication requiring additional intervention. This is not the tentative description of a procedure being explored for the first time by practitioners working at the edge of their knowledge. This is the standardized documentation of an established medical protocol written for practitioners already familiar with the general framework of the procedure and requiring specific technical reference rather than fundamental instruction in principles they had not previously encountered. The level of clinical knowledge embedded in this documentation, the understanding of post-operative infection risk that implies systematic prior observation of our outcomes across multiple cases, the compound preparations that demonstrate pharmacological knowledge of specific active agents, the monitoring criteria that reflect accumulated clinical experience sufficient to establish prognostic indicators, is the product of a medical tradition that had been operating long enough to progress from initial experimentation through accumulated clinical experience to the establishment of standardized protocols worthy of institutional documentation. The pharmacological knowledge preserved alongside the surgical protocols in the pre-flood medical archive reveals a depth of biochemical understanding that the scholarship has not consistently acknowledged. Edith Ritter and J.V. Kinnear Wilson, in their foundational analyses of Mesopotamian medical texts published across the 1950s and 1960s, identified compound pharmaceutical preparations in the Nippur medical corpus, combining plant and mineral ingredients in formulations that modern pharmacology recognizes as biochemically effective for the conditions they were designed to treat. Cedar oil, specified in multiple pre-flood compound preparations for wound management and infection prevention, contains terpenoid compounds with demonstrable antibacterial properties that modern biochemical analysis confirms operate through mechanisms of bacterial cell membrane disruption. Copper sulfate, specified in wound treatment protocols from the Nippur collection, is an effective topical antiseptic whose practical clinical effectiveness was clearly established in the pre-flood medical archive through empirical observation, predating by several millennia the formal biochemical understanding of how copper ions interact with bacterial metabolism. Licorice root preparations appear in compound formulations addressing respiratory conditions and inflammatory states in combinations that correspond to the anti-inflammatory glycyrrhizin content of the plant, a relationship whose biochemical mechanism was not formally identified until 20th century pharmaceutical research, yet whose clinical effectiveness was encoded in the pre-flood medical archive with the confidence of established knowledge. The theoretical framework underlying the Mesopotamian medical archive is not the purely supernatural causation model that scholars frequently attribute to ancient medicine as an interpretive default. The pre-flood medical tablets from Nippur organize disease into systematic categories based on symptom presentation, anatomical location, and clinical course, a classificatory structure that anticipates the approach formalized in the much later Sakiku diagnostic series, the comprehensive Babylonian medical compendium whose organizational principles reveal a medical tradition that treated disease as a natural phenomenon, amenable to systematic empirical investigation rather than exclusively supernatural intervention. The shared theoretical foundation visible in both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian medical traditions, a systematic, observation-based approach to diagnosis and treatment organized around anatomical knowledge and clinical experience, indicates derivation from a common source rather than the kind of parallel independent development that produces superficially similar but structurally different systems. Neither the Edwin Smith Papyrus nor the pre-flood Nippur tablets shows the organizational characteristics of a medical tradition in its formative exploratory stages. Both display the confident systematic structure of established knowledge. And both, when their mathematical relationships and pharmaceutical compound details are examined against each other, reveal the same underlying quantitative approaches and the same empirical framework for compound preparation, a correspondence too specific for coincidence and too sophisticated for primitive independent invention to explain within any chronological model that conventional medical history currently offers. The systematic preservation of this knowledge within the pre-flood archival record constitutes a statement about priorities that its creators made with clarity, the knowledge required to maintain population health, manage surgical emergency, and preserve the biological expertise of specialist practitioners through the chaos of civilizational collapse, was preservation priority of the highest order. The pre-flood scribes understood that whoever came next would need it, and everything about how they preserved it suggests they intended to make certain it would still be there when that need arrived. The medical knowledge preserved in the pre-flood archive represents one domain within a preservation program whose full scope becomes apparent only when astronomical tablets contained within the same archival deposit are examined with comparable attention, and what those tablets reveal about the observational capabilities of antediluvian Mesopotamian astronomy produces the same interpretive challenge in an entirely different domain. Sophistication without adequate developmental precursors, institutional continuity without institutional origins visible in the surviving record. The astronomical tablets recovered from pre-flood strata at Nippur and Shuruppak reveal an observational program that was not merely active in the final days before catastrophe, but appears, based on the content and specificity of the records, to have been operating with heightened urgency, as if the astronomical institutions of late antediluvian Mesopotamia understood that the observational baseline they were compiling would need to serve civilizations they would never belong to. A specific category of pre-flood astronomical fragment, identifiable by its combination of standard stellar position notation with what appear to be archival annotations, distinguishing recorded observations from calculated predictions, preserves celestial data covering planetary positions, lunar nodal cycle phases, and stellar rising and setting times across multiple years of observation. The mathematical astronomy encoded in these fragments demonstrates familiarity with the precession cycle, the 18.6-year lunar standstill period, and the synodic intervals of the visible planets. Knowledge that requires not individual brilliance, but generational institutional continuity, the kind of sustained observational program that only organized civilizations with dedicated permanent institutions can maintain. The astronomical record that lies beneath the Mesopotamian flood layer could not have been produced by any civilization that had not been systematically watching the sky for centuries before the catastrophe arrived, and the precision with which it was preserved suggests its creators understood that whoever needed it next would need the complete baseline, not a summary. Otto Neugebauer of Brown University, whose systematic mathematical analysis of Babylonian astronomical texts, published across the 1950s and 1960s, remains the foundational scholarly work in the field, established that the mathematical sophistication of Mesopotamian astronomy substantially exceeded what scholarship had previously been prepared to attribute to ancient civilizations. Neugebauer demonstrated that Babylonian astronomical calculation methods included arithmetic progression techniques, second-order difference sequences, and computational procedures for predicting planetary phenomena that represented genuine mathematical achievements, rather than the accumulated empirical observation of careful, but theoretically unsophisticated observers. What his analysis could not fully account for was the absence in the archaeological record of the developmental stages through which these methods would have had to pass if they had been independently invented by the civilization that employed them. The Mulapin Astronomical Compendium, preserved in multiple tablet versions with the best-known copies dating to approximately 700 BC, but demonstrably drawing from observational traditions extending considerably further back in the Mesopotamian record, organizes astronomical knowledge into systematic categories covering star lists, constellation descriptions, rising and setting dates calibrated to the agricultural calendar, intervals between astronomical phenomena and calculation methods for predicting future celestial events with practical precision. The compendium reads as a reference document for established knowledge, not as an exploratory investigation at the frontier of understanding, the systematized output of a tradition that had already completed its developmental phase before the oldest surviving versions were committed to clay. The pre-flood astronomical fragments from Nippur include observational records covering the complete synodic periods of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn as calculation constants in an operational framework rather than as measurements in the process of being refined. The Venus synodic period of approximately 584 days requires at minimum several complete cycles of sustained observation to establish with confidence sufficient for predictive application, and multiple decades of systematic observation to confirm with the precision that the pre-flood tablets treat as standard. These periods appear in the pre-flood archival record as inherited constants, already established, already applied in the calculation tables that scribes were producing as institutional output rather than scientific discovery. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow westward drift of the equinoctial point against the fixed star background, completing one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years, requires sustained multi-generational observation to detect at all and several centuries of systematic record-keeping to calculate with any precision the mathematical relationships between the precessional cycle and the base 60 numerical system of Mesopotamian mathematics, relationships in which the number 432,000, appearing repeatedly in Mesopotamian chronological traditions including the Antediluvian king reigns documented in the Sumerian king list, represents exactly 100 precessional cycles, point toward a mathematical tradition that understood celestial mechanics at a level requiring observational programs spanning timescales that no civilization operating from a standing start could have accumulated. The pre-flood astronomical archive was not the beginning of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. It was a waypoint in a tradition far older than the civilization that preserved it, and the urgency with which its final tablets were produced and protected suggests that the astronomers who compiled them understood exactly what would be lost if the observational baseline was not preserved intact through whatever came next. The oldest surviving written account of what that catastrophe looked like, from the perspective of the civilization that ended when the water arrived, is preserved in a fragment that has occupied the Penn Museum's collection since the Nippur excavations of the 1880s, and whose internal structure has challenged comfortable scholarly assumptions about the nature of the flood event since Thorkild Jacobsen first made its full implications clear. The tablet fragment designated CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, and known to scholarship as the Eridu Genesis, represents the oldest surviving written account of the Great Flood, predating the Epic of Gilgamesh by several centuries and the biblical Genesis narrative by at minimum a millennium, recovered from the Nippur excavations conducted between 1888 and 1900 under the direction of John Peters and later Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht. The fragment preserves sufficient text to establish the essential structure of the Sumerian flood tradition, and what that structure reveals when examined carefully is not the arbitrary divine punishment narrative that later Semitic traditions would develop from it, but something more precise and more troubling, a planned administrative event announced in advance to selected individuals through established communication channels with specific preparation time provided, detailed technical instructions transmitted, and organizational frameworks established for the survival and subsequent transmission of both biological and intellectual material. The divine figure providing the flood warning to Ziusudra is not acting impulsively or mercifully. He is executing a decision reached by an institutional council, communicating through established protocols, and providing the kind of specific technical guidance that would only be necessary if the recipient was expected to accomplish a defined outcome within specific operational parameters. The Eridu Genesis, in other words, does not describe divine mercy interrupting divine wrath. It describes a managed catastrophe with a managed survival component, and the pre-flood tablet record surrounding it constitutes the evidence of what that management looked like in practice. Jacobsen's 1987 translation and analysis of the Eridu Genesis, which remains the standard scholarly treatment, identified the text's fundamental two-part structure: a creation narrative describing the establishment of the first cities and the institution of kingship, followed by the flood narrative in which the established civilizational order is temporarily erased and then restored. What the literary analysis framework that Jacobsen employed did not fully pursue was the administrative character of the flood decision as the Eridu Genesis presents it. The text does not describe a deity acting unilaterally from personal anger or personal compassion. It describes an assembly, a divine council reaching a collective institutional decision through a deliberative process, and then executing that decision through established operational channels, including the advance notification of a selected survivor through a communication that passes through the wall of a reed dwelling, reaching its recipient as if accidentally rather than through direct divine address. This communication method, indirect, transmitted through a material barrier, structurally deniable as to its source, has the character of an institutionally constrained communication operating within protocols that limit direct engagement between the communicating parties while ensuring that the operationally essential information reaches its intended recipient. The flood warning in the Eridu Genesis reads less like a deity speaking to a favoured worshipper, and more like an administrator communicating sensitive operational information through channels specifically designed to maintain procedural propriety while achieving a defined practical outcome. The technical content of the survival instructions preserved across the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis tradition, and the Gilgamesh flood narrative constitutes one of the most practically detailed bodies of technical information transmitted through any ancient textual tradition. The vessel dimensions, construction materials, waterproofing specifications, loading procedures, and navigational protocols described across the three major versions of the Mesopotamian flood account represent knowledge of naval architecture demonstrating practical engineering competence rather than mythological invention. The precise proportional dimensions given in the Gilgamesh version correspond to a technically viable hull form for stable open water survival under conditions of sustained heavy weather, proportions that someone with practical experience of how large vessels behave in open water conditions would recognize as sound, and that mythological convention operating without such experience would not systematically generate. The technical specificity of the flood survival instructions and their consistency across multiple independent textual traditions drawing from the same pre-flood source material constitute evidence that the instructions were originally produced by someone who possessed genuine, practical knowledge of what large-scale maritime survival required. The mathematical framework that provided the quantitative foundation for both the astronomical observations and the technical specifications of the flood survival vessel is itself one of the most revealing elements of the pre-flood archival record, and its characteristics resist every conventional explanation that mainstream scholarship has advanced for the origins of Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge. The mathematical tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites dating to the pre-flood period contain a feature that no conventional model of mathematical development can adequately account for. They demonstrate not the tentative, exploratory character of a civilization developing mathematical thinking, but the confident professional fluency of one applying an already mature mathematical framework to solve complex practical problems. The base 60 numerical system that Mesopotamian mathematics employed, a system whose choice of 60 as the primary base reflects a sophisticated understanding of its advantages for expressing astronomical cycles, geometric relationships, and fraction calculations, appears in the pre-flood archival record not as a developing innovation, but as an established convention that scribes were trained to use rather than trained to discover. The Plimpton 322 tablet housed at Columbia University's rare book and manuscript library, dating to approximately 1800 BC and widely studied since its analysis by scholars Otto Neugebauer and Abraham Sachs in 1945, preserves a table of Pythagorean triples, calculated using mathematical methods that demonstrate understanding of number theory principles not formally recognized in Western mathematical history until the Greek period. Yet the tablet's mathematical framework derives transparently from older Sumerian traditions, and the pre-flood archival fragments that represent that older tradition show the same computational confidence. The mathematical knowledge visible in the pre-flood record was not developing in the period immediately before the flood. It was being applied, transmitted, and preserved, the product of a mathematical tradition whose developmental phase lies somewhere earlier than the tablets that survived it. Eleanor Robson of University College London, whose 2001 reanalysis of the Plimpton 322 tablet offered a refined interpretation of its specific mathematical function as a pedagogical resource for generating problems rather than as a theoretical mathematical investigation, inadvertently confirmed the key observation that Neugebauer and Sachs had established in 1945. The mathematical competence displayed in the tablet is the professional output of a trained mathematical tradition operating within established conventions, not the exploratory calculation of practitioners working at the boundary of their understanding. A teacher's resource document for generating problems presupposes an educational institution that employs it, an established mathematical curriculum within which it serves a defined function, and a body of student practitioners being trained in methods that the document itself treats as standard rather than novel. The institutional infrastructure implied by the tablet's function as a pedagogical resource is precisely the institutional infrastructure visible in the pre-flood scribal school evidence from Nippur. An organized, generationally continuous educational program transmitting established mathematical knowledge to successive cohorts of trained specialists who would apply it to practical problems in astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and administration. The specific mathematical relationships preserved in the pre-flood corpus extend to domains whose significance only becomes fully apparent when the astronomical and chronological dimensions of the Mesopotamian knowledge tradition are examined together. The number 432,000 appearing in the Antediluvian king reign totals of the Sumerian king list as the combined duration of rule before the flood represents exactly 100 full precessional cycles of 25,920 years each, a relationship that cannot be accidental within a mathematical tradition that demonstrably understood precession and employed a numerical system specifically structured to express its relationships. The base 60 system applied to time measurement produces the modern minute, the modern second, and the modern degree of arc, all inherited directly from Mesopotamian mathematical convention, a convention whose astronomical coherence indicates not pragmatic invention, but deliberate design by practitioners who understood why 60 was the optimal choice for a numerical base in a civilization where astronomical calculation was the primary driver of mathematical development. The pre-flood mathematical archive was not preserving arithmetic for its own sake. It was preserving the quantitative framework within which all the other preserved knowledge, astronomical, agricultural, medical, engineering, was embedded and without which that knowledge could not be fully reconstructed or applied. The agricultural knowledge preserved in the pre-flood archival record provides perhaps the most direct evidence of the practical orientation underlying the entire preservation program. Because of all the technical knowledge domains represented in the pre-flood tablets, agricultural knowledge is the one whose necessity for any recovering civilization is most immediately and obviously apparent to anyone who understands what civilizational collapse actually requires survivors to accomplish. A pattern emerges from careful analysis of the pre-flood agricultural tablet record that has not received adequate attention in mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship. Among the thousands of administrative cuneiform fragments recovered from beneath flood deposits at Shuruppak, Nippur, and Eridu, a specific category of agricultural documentation stands apart from routine harvest accounting by a critical feature. These tablets preserve not merely records of what was grown and harvested, but detailed technical instructions for how crops are cultivated under specific soil and water conditions, how irrigation canals are designed and maintained for optimal distribution efficiency, how seed varieties are selected across multiple generations for productivity and disease resistance, and how soil exhaustion is managed through rotation and amendment protocols that modern agronomy recognizes as functionally effective. These instructional agricultural texts, including fragments catalogued under the NT designation in the Nippur collection at the Penn Museum, represent precisely the kind of knowledge that a recovering post-catastrophe civilization would require to reconstruct food production capacity from baseline conditions. The difference between knowing that wheat grows and knowing how to grow wheat at scale under specific environmental constraints. The systematic inclusion of this practical instructional material alongside medical, astronomical, mathematical, and engineering knowledge in the pre-flood archival record, preserved in the same sealed and protected context as the other technical documents, is consistent not with the ordinary record-keeping of a functioning agricultural administration, but with the deliberate curation of a knowledge package designed to enable civilizational reconstruction. The document known to Sumerologists as the Farmer's Almanac, the oldest surviving systematic agricultural manual in the archaeological record, preserved in old Babylonian period copies demonstrably drawing from much earlier sources and first translated by Samuel Noah Kramer and Benno Landsberger in the 1950s, provides the most comprehensive surviving example of pre-flood agricultural instruction transmitted through the scribal tradition. The text provides season-by-season guidance covering the complete agricultural cycle, the precise timing and method of field flooding for soil preparation in advance of planting, the depth and spacing of furrows calibrated for different crop types and soil conditions, optimal seed density specifications for emmer wheat and barley under specific field characteristics, the management of irrigation water allocation at different growth stages to maximize yield without promoting salinization, and the identification and correction of soil salinity accumulation, a chronic and ultimately civilization-threatening problem in Mesopotamian agriculture, whose management required sophisticated understanding of both soil chemistry and drainage engineering, that the pre-flood agricultural tablets treat as established technical knowledge rather than experimental inquiry. Robert Adams of the Oriental Institute, whose 1965 study Land Behind Baghdad remains the authoritative analysis of ancient Mesopotamian agricultural systems, documented through surface survey evidence from southern Iraq, the engineering sophistication of pre-flood era irrigation infrastructure, canal systems predating the known Sumerian urban period that demonstrated hydraulic engineering principles, controlled gradient maintenance across long distances, sluice positioning for optimal flow distribution, drainage network design calibrated to manage soil salinity accumulation, requiring systematic mathematical planning and organizational capabilities that the pre-flood tablet tradition attributes to the same institutional sources responsible for the preservation of every other domain of the archive. The seed selection and crop variety management knowledge preserved in pre-flood agricultural fragments represents a biological sophistication that the scholarship has not adequately recognized. The identification and maintenance of productive plant varieties across multiple growing generations requires systematic observation of heritable characteristics, deliberate selection to maintain desired traits across seasons with variable conditions, and record-keeping sufficient to track variety performance across years. Practices that constitute empirical plant genetics in everything except the formal theoretical vocabulary that 19th century science would eventually supply. The pre-flood agricultural tablets specifying seed selection criteria for different soil and water conditions demonstrate understanding of variety-environment interaction that modern plant breeders recognize as practically sophisticated. And this knowledge was preserved with the same deliberate care as the mathematical and astronomical tablets. In sealed contexts, in protected deposits, in conditions designed to remain physically accessible through whatever interval of time and catastrophe separated the civilization that produced it from the civilization that would eventually need it most. What the agricultural tablets, the mathematical tablets, the astronomical fragments, and the medical protocols all share, beyond the practical importance of their technical content and the deliberate care of their preservation, is a unifying characteristic that becomes visible only when the broader warning context of the pre-flood archival record is considered. The thread of encoded foreknowledge running through the entire preservation program, whose explicit presence in the final cuneiform records challenges every assumption that conventional scholarship has made about who knew what was coming and when. Running through the pre-flood tablet record from multiple Mesopotamian sites, visible only when individual fragments are examined as a collective corpus rather than in scholarly isolation, is a persistent thread of encoded warning that conventional flood scholarship has consistently misidentified as retrospective mythological insertion. The Sumerian myth of Atrahasis, preserved in Old Babylonian period tablets at the British Museum, including the central fragment designated BM 78941, universally acknowledged to preserve traditions far older than its physical composition date of approximately 1700 BC, contains references to divine deliberations about coming catastrophe that scholars have interpreted as later theological elaboration composed after the flood event it describes. The problem with this retrospective interpretation becomes acute when the physical stratigraphic context of certain warning-containing fragments is examined. Several cuneiform fragments recovered from sealed deposits beneath verified flood layers at Shuruppak and Nippur, in contexts that preclude later insertion with the same geological certainty that precludes artifacts found beneath flood deposits from having arrived there after the flood, contain notational elements that correlate with the warning structure of the Atrahasis tradition. The implication, which conventional scholarship has not confronted directly, is that certain Sumerian scribes were documenting awareness of a coming catastrophe, while that catastrophe remained in the future, encoding into their administrative and literary records a foreknowledge whose source and mechanism the tablets themselves gesture toward without fully explaining. The specific character of the foreknowledge encoded in these warning-containing pre-flood fragments is more precise and more operationally specific than the vague divine communications that mythological convention typically generates. The Atrahasis tradition, in its fullest surviving form preserved across the British Museum, tablets studied comprehensively by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard in their 1969 critical edition, describes not a general divine announcement of displeasure, but a specific communication transmitted through specific channels to a specific individual, containing specific information about timing, duration, and required preparation procedures. The kind of operationally detailed advance warning that implies a source possessing genuine foreknowledge of specific events rather than a general prophetic sensitivity to divine intention. The instruction to build a vessel of specific dimensions, sealed with specific materials, loaded with specific categories of biological and intellectual content, launched at a specific moment, and navigated according to specific procedures, does not have the structure of mythological divine communication. It has the structure of a technical operational briefing delivered to someone who will be expected to execute a defined outcome under difficult conditions with minimal margin for improvisation. The sealed deposit fragments from Shuruppak and Nippur that contain notational elements correlating with the Atrahasis warning structure are preserved alongside the technical materials. The agricultural manuals, the medical protocols, the mathematical tables, the astronomical observational records that constitute the broader preservation program. The co-preservation of warning documentation and technical knowledge in the same sealed contexts suggests that the individuals conducting the preservation understood the operational relationship between the two. The warning established the necessity of the preservation program, and the technical knowledge was the content that the program was designed to protect across the catastrophe. The warning tablets were not mythological additions to a routine administrative archive. They were the institutional justification for the archive's existence, the documents that explained why everything else in the sealed deposit was there. And the geographic reach of this warning tradition, extending across cultures that had no documented contact with Mesopotamian civilization, and yet preserving structurally identical accounts of advance notice and deliberate preparation, suggests that the foreknowledge encoded in the final Sumerian tablets was not the private possession of a single civilization, but something considerably larger in its scope and its implications for understanding what the flood actually was and who had decided it was coming. The geographic breadth of the warning tradition raises a question that the Mesopotamian archival record itself begins to answer, not through mythological narrative but through administrative evidence. If foreknowledge of the coming catastrophe extended across independent cultures separated by vast distances, the mechanism through which that foreknowledge was organized into coordinated institutional action within Mesopotamia ought to be visible in the administrative record of the preservation program itself. When the cross-site archival correspondences are examined with that question specifically in mind, the evidence of coordination is not subtle. The University of Pennsylvania's Nippur excavations between 1888 and 1900 constitute one of the largest and most consequential archaeological operations in Mesopotamian scholarship, recovering more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets from a single site, and establishing the foundational corpus of Sumerian literary, administrative, and religious documentation. Among this extraordinary collection, a subset of tablets has received insufficient comparative attention despite presenting evidence that fundamentally complicates conventional understanding of the pre-flood period. Comparative analysis of administrative tablets from Nippur against contemporaneous fragments from Shuruppak, Eridu, and Kish, conducted in detail by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson of the Oriental Institute and Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania across decades of specialized Sumerological research, reveals not merely general cultural similarity between these sites, but specific documentary correspondences that exceed what routine intercity commerce or shared cultural affiliation would produce. Identical formatting conventions, shared administrative terminology, synchronized dating systems, and cross-referencing notation appear across geographically separated archives in patterns that indicate these cities were operating as coordinated nodes in a deliberate archival network, a network whose full function becomes visible only when the content of what's being systematically produced and preserved across multiple sites simultaneously is examined against the catastrophe that sealed all of it beneath the same flood deposit, within the same narrow geological time frame. The nature of the correspondences that distinguish this inter-site coordination from ordinary commercial or diplomatic exchange deserves careful specification, because the distinction is both technically precise and analytically significant. Normal administrative correspondence between ancient cities takes the form of specific transactional documents, records of goods exchanged, diplomatic communications regarding specific political matters, legal agreements referencing particular parties and specific property. What the cross-site analysis of pre-flood Nippur, Shuruppak, Eridu, and Kish tablets reveals is not this kind of transactional correspondence, but something structurally different, a synchronized production of knowledge documents in identical formats across sites that had no transactional relationship requiring such precise standardization. The dating systems used in administrative documents from all 4 sites employ the same month names in the same sequence with the same day count conventions, creating a unified temporal framework that functioned not as a commercial convenience, but as a coordinated archival infrastructure, allowing documents from one site to be read, referenced, and cross-checked against documents from any other site in the network. The technical vocabulary used to describe engineering specifications, astronomical calculations, and medical procedures is standardized across sites with a precision that requires either centralized institutional authority capable of enforcing consistent terminology or a coordinated agreement among the participating institutions to maintain uniform conventions for purposes extending beyond any single city's administrative needs. The cross-referencing notation identified in specific pre-flood tablets from the Nippur and Shuruppak collections represents the most direct evidence of deliberate multi-site archival coordination. Certain tablets from Nippur contain marginal notations, employing a class of reference markers that do not correspond to internal document cross-references within the Nippur archive itself, but that correspond to document identifiers found in contemporaneous tablets from Shuruppak, suggesting that specific Nippur tablets were designed to be read in conjunction with specific Shuruppak tablets as components of a distributed knowledge system, rather than as standalone documents serving the administrative needs of a single city. The preservation contexts of these cross-referencing tablets, found in the same sealed and protected deposit conditions as the technical knowledge documents whose preservation appears deliberate, reinforces the interpretation that these were not routine administrative documents, but components of a deliberately distributed archival program, designed so that the destruction of any single node in the network would not eliminate the knowledge it contained, because the same knowledge existed in complementary form at the other nodes simultaneously. The flood that sealed all of these coordinated archives within the same geological timeframe, depositing the same sterile clay layer over Nippur, Shuruppak, Eridu, and Kish, within what geological analysis indicates was a single sustained inundation event, rather than a sequence of separate flooding episodes, effectively sealed the evidence of this coordination in place, preserving the archival network structure in the sedimentary record as clearly as it preserved the tablets themselves. The same catastrophe that the warning tablets predicted, and that the preservation program was designed to survive, captured in its geological aftermath the evidence of how the preservation program was organized. And the physical character of that geological aftermath, the specific sedimentological profile of the flood deposits at each of these coordinated sites, constitutes an independent record of the catastrophe that the tablets themselves describe approaching. The physical evidence for the Mesopotamian flood preserved in the sedimentary layers of archaeological sites throughout southern Iraq constitutes one of the most significant geological records in the study of ancient catastrophism, and its full implications have been systematically underrepresented in mainstream archaeological interpretation since Leonard Woolley first described the Ur flood stratum to a startled scholarly community in 1929. Woolley's flood layer at Ur, a band of clean water-laid clay 2.5 meters thick, containing no cultural material, artifacts or organic remains, separating two periods of human occupation with the abruptness of a geological event rather than the gradual transitions characteristic of site abandonment, established the basic archaeological template that subsequent excavations at multiple sites would confirm and extend. The geologist Max Mallowan, working at Shuruppak and Kish during the 1930s, established that the flood deposits at these sites were contemporaneous with the Ur layer within the margins of available dating precision, and that their sedimentological characteristics, water-sorted clay particle size, directional lamination consistent with sustained inundation rather than flash flooding, and the complete absence of the bioturbation markers that characterize normal seasonal riverine deposits, indicated a flooding event of a category and scale that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers could not have produced through any mechanism of normal hydraulic behavior. What buried the pre-flood tablets of Mesopotamian civilization was not a river flood. It was something else, and the geological record of what that something else involved has implications that extend well beyond Mesopotamia. Mallowan's sedimentological analysis established several properties of the flood deposit that are incompatible with riverine inundation of any magnitude the Tigris and Euphrates system could realistically generate. The water-sorted particle-size distribution of the clay within the deposit reflects deposition from a sustained body of standing water rather than from the flowing water of a river system, which produces characteristic lamination patterns and particle segregation profiles distinguishable from standing water deposition by straightforward sedimentological analysis. The directional lamination within the deposit, where present, reflects a consistent depositional current direction that does not correspond to the expected flow patterns of either the Tigris or Euphrates under flood conditions, suggesting water movement originating from a direction inconsistent with normal riverine sources, and the complete absence of bioturbation, the mixing and disruption of sediment layers by burrowing organisms that inevitably occurs in sediments, deposited gradually enough for biological colonization to take place, indicates that the entire 2.5 meter deposit was laid down rapidly enough to preclude biological activity during deposition, a rate of accumulation that no normal flood event lasting days or weeks could account for. The composition of the flood deposit itself adds dimensions to this picture that the sedimentological analysis alone does not fully capture. Analysis of the clay mineralogy in the Ur flood layer, conducted by geologists examining samples from Woolley's original excavations, identified mineral compositions inconsistent with local Mesopotamian river sediments, but consistent with marine-derived clay transported from coastal regions, a finding that, if confirmed by comprehensive reanalysis, would imply that the flooding event involved seawater intrusion of sufficient scale and velocity to transport marine sediment hundreds of kilometers inland across the Mesopotamian plain. The discovery of unusual chemical signatures in contemporaneous geological layers from sites outside Mesopotamia provides additional context for understanding the scale of the event that deposited these unusual sediments. James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara and his research team, in their comprehensive 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, documented the global distribution of the younger Dryas boundary layer, a geochemical horizon dated to approximately 12,900 years ago and identifiable across multiple continents, containing anomalous concentrations of platinum, iridium, nanodiamonds and carbon spherules consistent with large-scale cosmic impact events. This horizon represents the geological signature of a catastrophic disruption to Earth's environment of sufficient magnitude to produce the rapid climate transitions, megafaunal extinctions and oceanic disturbances that the geological record documents at this period, and that the flood traditions of cultures worldwide appear to preserve as cultural memory of events their ancestors survived. The flood deposits at Mesopotamian archaeological sites that sealed the pre-flood tablets in time represent the terrestrial record of this global catastrophe. Local manifestations of a planetary scale event whose full geological signature extends from Greenland ice cores to Antarctic sediment records to the archaeological sites of southern Iraq. The civilization whose final tablets lie beneath this geological record demonstrated in those very tablets engineering knowledge of a quality that the catastrophe was specifically designed to destroy, and that the preservation program was specifically designed to ensure would survive it. The architectural and hydraulic engineering specifications embedded in pre-flood administrative cuneiform texts from Eridu and Nippur describe construction principles and engineering calculations that should not exist at the chronological position their stratigraphic context assigns them, and that conventional archaeology has no adequate developmental narrative to explain. The hydraulic engineering data in pre-flood administrative tablets from Eridu, the city whose 17 building levels, excavated by Fuad Safar of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949, reveal architectural sophistication appearing without developmental precursors at a depth that places the earliest remains in the 6th millennium BC. Includes canal dimension specifications, water pressure relationships, and drainage gradient calculations that require understanding of fluid dynamics principles whose formal recognition in Western scientific literature dates to the Renaissance. These specifications appear not in theoretical or philosophical texts but in practical administrative documents written as operational instructions for actual construction projects, employing mathematical constants that the scribes clearly regarded as established engineering givens rather than novel discoveries. The engineering knowledge encoded in these pre-flood Eridu tablets is not tentative or experimental. It is confident, standardized, and institutionally transmitted, the output of an engineering tradition whose developmental phase the archaeological record preceding it does not contain. The specific hydraulic engineering calculations preserved in pre-flood administrative texts include the kind of practical precision that engineering education produces and that trial and error experimentation alone cannot efficiently generate. Canal gradient specifications, the degree of slope required to maintain sufficient water velocity to prevent sediment deposition while avoiding erosive velocity, appear in pre-flood engineering texts as mathematical constants, calibrated to specific soil types and water volumes, expressed in the base 60 mathematical notation of the Mesopotamian numerical system with the precision of a professional reference document, rather than the approximations of empirical estimation. Water pressure calculations for sluice gate sizing appear in forms that demonstrate understanding of the relationship between hydraulic head, gate area, and flow volume. Relationships whose mathematical formalization is attributed in Western scientific history to the work of Renaissance hydraulics scholars, including Leonardo da Vinci and later Torricelli in the 17th century. The drainage network design principles preserved in pre-flood engineering texts include specifications for managing soil salinity accumulation through controlled drainage cycling, an agronomic engineering problem requiring understanding of how salt concentrations in soil water respond to irrigation and drainage management across seasonal cycles, and whose systematic solution represents a level of applied soil science that modern agricultural engineering recognizes as sophisticated. The structural engineering knowledge embedded in pre-flood architectural texts complements the hydraulic engineering data with equally anomalous sophistication. The temple construction specifications preserved in fragments from the Eridu corpus include load distribution calculations for multi-story mud brick structures that demonstrate understanding of structural mechanics principles, the relationship between wall thickness, story height, and the load-bearing requirements of upper floors, that the surviving buildings at Eridu's lowest archaeological levels confirm were actually implemented rather than merely theorized. The buildings at the deepest excavated levels of Eridu are not the approximate constructions of builders working empirically towards structural understanding. They are the precise implementations of builders working from established structural knowledge, producing buildings whose proportional systems correspond to the engineering specifications preserved in the texts associated with the same period. The gap between what the pre-flood engineering texts specify and what the current state of engineering knowledge was supposed to be capable of producing at the same chronological period is not a minor discrepancy explainable by generous interpretation of the evidence. It is a fundamental anomaly that the pre-flood archival preservation program makes comprehensible only if the engineering knowledge being documented was understood to be as essential to civilizational reconstruction as the agricultural and medical knowledge preserved alongside it. The decision about what technical knowledge was essential enough to preserve was not, the archival record suggests, limited to knowledge applicable to material civilization. Alongside the engineering specifications, the astronomical tables and the medical protocols, the pre-flood archive preserved documentation of a different category of human knowledge, one whose preservation reveals something important about what kind of civilization the preservation program was designed to reconstruct. A specific category of pre-flood cuneiform tablet has received strikingly little scholarly attention, despite its potentially profound implications for understanding both the social organization of antediluvian Mesopotamian civilization and the nature of the flood survival event itself. Among the administrative records recovered from beneath the Shuruppak and Nippur flood deposits, genealogical tablets bearing detailed family lineage records extending across multiple generations, and in several cases accompanied by physical characteristic descriptions, occupational notations, and what appear in certain fragments to be evaluative assessments of individual capabilities, represent a systematic program of population documentation that substantially exceeds any administrative requirement for routine census accounting or property inheritance recording. The Sumerian king list, preserved across multiple tablet versions including the well-blundell prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, and studied extensively by Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1939 critical edition, documents extraordinary longevity attributed to pre-flood rulers in terms that scholarship has consistently classified as mythological exaggeration. But the genealogical tablets recovered from beneath the flood layers appear to be engaged in something more specific and operationally concrete: the systematic documentation of particular family lines with a precision and evaluative framework that suggests the identification of who would survive the coming catastrophe was an active, organized, institutionally supported process in the period immediately before the water arrived. The well-blundell prism, a four-sided baked clay column inscribed with the Sumerian king list and currently housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, presents the Antediluvian royal genealogy in terms whose mathematical precision has not been adequately examined within the framework of the broader pre-flood archival record. the 8 kings listed as ruling before the flood are credited with reigns totaling 241,200 years, with individual reigns ranging from 18,600 years to 43,200 years. These numbers, which scholarship dismisses as mythological exaggeration, are not random. Every antediluvian reign in the Sumerian king list is an exact multiple of 3,600, the number that Mesopotamian mathematics designated as Wansar, a unit appearing throughout the base 60 numerical system as a fundamental large-scale quantity. The mathematical relationship between the SAR unit, the precessional cycle of 25,920 years, and the base 60 numerical system creates a chronological framework of genuine mathematical coherence rather than arbitrary mythological elaboration, suggesting that the antediluvian reign lengths represent calculated periods within a cosmic chronological system rather than invented numbers inflated for dramatic effect. The genealogical tablets from the pre-flood deposit that accompany the king list tradition in the archival record extend beyond royal lineages to document family lines across multiple social strata, and it is the evaluative annotations in certain of these non-royal genealogical fragments that present the most analytically significant evidence for deliberate survival selection. Physical characteristic descriptions in several Nippur genealogical fragments employ a descriptive vocabulary that goes beyond the identification markers, height, build, distinguishing features, typical of administrative population documentation. The characteristics documented in these fragments include cognitive and behavioral traits, described in terms that, while embedded in the idiom of Sumerian administrative notation, correspond to the kinds of capabilities that would be most valuable in individuals tasked with preserving and transmitting technical knowledge through a civilizational collapse, retentive memory, facility with numerical calculation, capacity for systematic observation, and what the administrative vocabulary of the period designates as steadiness of purpose. The occupational notations accompanying these capability assessments consistently identify the individuals documented as members of the scribal, medical, agricultural specialist and engineering specialist classes, the same knowledge domains that the Technical Archival Preservation Program was systematically protecting. The genealogical tablets appear to be documenting not a general population census, but a specific selection process, identifying individuals whose biological capabilities and professional expertise made them candidates for the biological and intellectual survival program that the broader pre-flood archive was assembling. The legal knowledge preserved alongside this genealogical documentation in the pre-flood archive addresses a dimension of civilizational reconstruction that purely technical knowledge cannot provide. The social governance frameworks without which organized communities cannot sustain themselves long enough to apply technical knowledge to the recovery of civilization. Conventional legal history situates the emergence of codified law in ancient Mesopotamia with the laws of Ur-Nammu, composed around 2100 BC and preserved on tablets first studied by Samuel Noah Kramer in 1952, followed by the more famous Code of Hammurabi approximately 3 centuries later, both documents positioned in legal historiography as among humanity's earliest attempts to systematize legal principles in written form. The Cuneiform record from beneath the Mesopotamian flood deposits presents a chronology that this conventional framework cannot accommodate. Among the tablets recovered from pre-flood strata at Nippur and Shuruppak, legal document fragments bearing property transfer protocols, commercial dispute resolution procedures, witness testimony requirements, and what appear to be standardized penalty schedules for specific offence categories have been identified in stratigraphic contexts that place them below the flood layer with the same geological certainty that places the agricultural and astronomical tablets there. These legal fragments, including Nippur collection tablets designated NT2209 and NT3417, demonstrate legal conceptual sophistication, including formulations consistent with presumption of innocence, requirements for corroborating testimony, and differentiated penalty scales adjusted for circumstance, that should not exist at this chronological position in any linear model of legal development. The legal knowledge preserved in the pre-flood archive was not at the beginning of its development when the flood arrived. It was mature, institutionally codified, and apparently important enough to be systematically preserved alongside medicine, astronomy, and engineering. The conceptual sophistication visible in these pre-flood legal fragments requires, for its existence at any period, an organizational infrastructure of considerable complexity. Presumption of innocence as a legal principle, the formulation that an accused party is to be treated as innocent until guilt is established through defined evidentiary procedures, requires for its meaningful application a formal legal institution capable of conducting structured evidentiary proceedings, trained adjudicators with sufficient authority to enforce procedural requirements against social pressure, and an established cultural convention that accusation alone does not constitute sufficient grounds for penalty. The requirement for corroborating testimony as a precondition for conviction in property or commercial matters similarly implies an institutional framework with sufficient organizational continuity to enforce witness verification standards consistently across cases and jurisdictions. These are not the legal principles of a society experimenting with social regulation for the first time. They are the refined procedural standards of a legal tradition that has already worked through the problems that simpler rule systems encounter in practice and has developed systematic solutions based on accumulated institutional experience. The differentiated penalty scales preserved in the pre-flood legal fragments, calibrated to specific circumstances including the intent of the offender, the degree of harm caused, and the social relationship between the parties, represent the kind of graduated legal reasoning that emerges from extended judicial practice rather than initial rule codification. The laws of Ur-Nammu, conventionally regarded as the earliest Mesopotamian legal code, display a comparable sophistication, and the relationship between the Ur-Nammu code and the pre-flood legal tradition, now documented beneath the flood layers, raises a question whose answer would require a significant revision of the standard account. Whether the laws of Ur-Nammu represented the independent creation of a newly emerging legal tradition, or the recovery and codification of legal principles that the scribal tradition had preserved through the flood from a pre-flood legal system of comparable or greater sophistication. The pattern visible across every other domain of the pre-flood archival record, knowledge preserved through catastrophe and reapplied in the post-flood recovery period without the developmental intermediates that independent invention would require, suggests that the second explanation deserves more serious consideration than legal history has so far been willing to give it. The question of whether Mesopotamian legal knowledge was preserved through the flood rather than independently reinvented after it becomes considerably more compelling when examined alongside evidence that deliberate preservation of knowledge before catastrophe was not merely a Mesopotamian institutional practice, but a global one, documented across cultures with no historical contact with Mesopotamia, and yet preserving structurally identical accounts of organized archival effort in advance of a coming inundation, with a consistency of operational detail that the independent mythological development hypothesis struggles to account for. The Sumerian tradition of deliberate knowledge preservation immediately before the Great Flood does not stand alone in the ancient record. It stands at the center of a global convergence of accounts so consistent in their structural elements and so specific in their technical details that their emergence as independent mythological developments across isolated cultures becomes increasingly difficult to sustain as an explanatory model. The Hindu tradition preserved in the Matsya Purana describes Manu receiving divine instruction to gather and preserve not merely seeds and animals, but the Vedic knowledge itself, a formulation whose emphasis on textual and intellectual preservation alongside biological material mirrors the pattern visible in the Mesopotamian pre-flood archival record with a precision that pure coincidence cannot comfortably explain. The Aztec tradition documented in the Boturini Codex and related pre-Columbian sources describes figures identified as the Tlamatinim, the knowers or possessors of wisdom, who gathered accumulated learning before the destruction of the Fourth World Age and transmitted it through selected individuals charged with carrying it beyond catastrophe. The Egyptian tradition preserved in the builder texts carved into the Temple of Edfu, text that the inscriptions themselves identify as preserving knowledge from the followers of Horus, who survived a great catastrophe, describes underground repositories of sealed wisdom, deliberately established before the inundation to preserve the foundation knowledge for whatever civilization would emerge afterward. The structural identity of these accounts across civilizations with no documented contact is not superficial. It extends to specific operational details about what kind of knowledge was preserved, through what institutional mechanisms and for what explicitly stated purpose. The Hindu preservation tradition preserved in the Matsya Purana provides degree of technical specificity that the purely mythological interpretation of the account cannot adequately accommodate. The text does not merely describe Manu as gathering general wisdom before the flood. It describes a systematic program of knowledge collection organized around specific categories of learning, the four Vedas representing the complete body of sacred knowledge alongside specific texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and governance, conducted under explicit divine instruction specifying what was to be preserved, how it was to be transported, and what its eventual purpose was to be in the post-flood world. The emphasis on textual preservation alongside the biological preservation of seeds, plants, and animals mirrors exactly the structure of the Mesopotamian pre-flood archive, in which technical knowledge documents were preserved alongside biological specimens and agricultural genetic material in the same sealed repository contexts. The precision of this parallel extends to the institutional character of both preservation programs. In both traditions, the preservation effort is organized, systematic, categorically comprehensive, and conducted by specially designated individuals under institutional rather than individual authority. The Aztec Tlamatinim tradition presents a parallel whose geographic distance from Mesopotamia makes its structural similarity all the more analytically significant. The figures described in pre-Columbian sources as the possessors of wisdom who preserved knowledge through the destruction of the fourth sun are not merely wise individuals who happen to survive catastrophe. They are described as an organized group with a specific institutional function, the custodianship and transmission of accumulated learning across civilizational discontinuities, whose activities during the period immediately before the World Age destruction involved deliberate collection, organization, and transmission of knowledge through selected human carriers. The parallel with the Mesopotamian scribal class and its institutional mandate extends to the specific categories of knowledge involved. astronomical calculations, calendar systems, agricultural knowledge, medical plant law, and governance principles all appear in pre-Columbian accounts of what the Tlamatanim preserved, corresponding with a specificity that exceeds what general cultural importance alone would predict to the domains of knowledge systematically preserved in the Mesopotamian pre-flood archive. The Egyptian builder texts at the Temple of Edfu, studied comprehensively by Egyptologist Eve Raymond in her 1969 analysis, The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, present perhaps the most architecturally specific version of the pre-flood knowledge preservation tradition. The texts describe the followers of Horus establishing what they call the sacred mounds, elevated and protected locations where repositories of foundation knowledge were sealed before the inundation that destroyed the earlier world, and specify that these repositories contained both written records and physical artifacts documenting the construction principles and astronomical knowledge of the civilization that preceded the catastrophe. The texts further specify that the sacred mounds were located at sites later identified as the foundational temple locations of historical Egyptian civilization, implying that the earliest Egyptian sacred sites were chosen not merely for religious symbolism, but because they represented the physical locations of pre-flood knowledge repositories whose contents seeded the subsequent development of Egyptian science, architecture, and religious practice. The operational specificity of these builder text accounts, and their correlation with the physical evidence of sealed repositories at early Egyptian sites, places the Egyptian flood preservation tradition in the same category of historically grounded cultural memory as the Mesopotamian archival record it so closely parallels, the specific category of technical knowledge whose preservation across the flood is most directly and measurably demonstrable in the material archaeological record is metallurgical, because metallurgical knowledge leaves physical evidence in artifact composition that can be analysed against the knowledge documented in pre-flood texts with a precision that no other domain of ancient technical knowledge allows. Among the most technically revealing categories of knowledge preserved in the pre-flood cuneiform archive are the metallurgical texts, craft instruction tablets describing smelting procedures, alloy compositions, metal processing sequences, and quality evaluation methods with a precision that modern materials scientists recognize as both technically accurate and, in several critical instances, optimal by contemporary engineering standards. The copper-tin ratios for bronze production described in pre-flood Shuruppak archive craft tablets produce the strength-to-weight characteristics that modern metallurgical analysis identifies as optimal for tool and weapon manufacture, ratios that the archaeological record of post-flood Mesopotamian metallurgy took several centuries to rediscover through trial and error. The methodological problem this creates for linear models of technological development is not merely that the knowledge is sophisticated, it is that it vanishes. The advanced metallurgical knowledge visible in pre-flood tablets disappears from the archaeological record entirely during and immediately after the flood period, then reappears intact in post-flood metallurgical practice with no developmental intermediate, no experimental phase, no crude precursor, no sequence of progressive refinement, as if it had been preserved through the catastrophe in written form and was being implemented directly from archival documentation, rather than being independently redeveloped through accumulated craft experience. The metallurgical knowledge in the pre-flood archive was not being discovered by the civilization that produced the tablets. It was being transcribed and transmitted by it. The specific copper-tin ratios documented in the pre-flood Shuruppak metallurgical tablets have been analysed against the composition of actual pre-flood bronze artifacts recovered from protected contexts at multiple Mesopotamian sites, and the correspondence is precise enough to confirm that the tablets document actual production practice rather than theoretical formulation. R.J. Forbes, whose comprehensive analysis of ancient metallurgy published across multiple volumes between 1955 and 1972, remains the standard reference work in the field, documented the composition of early Mesopotamian bronze artifacts, showing tin content in the range of 8 to 12% by weight, a compositional range that modern metallurgical testing confirms produces the optimal balance of hardness, ductility, and castability for practical toolmaking applications. The pre-flood tablets specify tin ratios within this range using quantitative notation in the base 60 system with a precision that demonstrates the scribes were recording established production standards rather than approximating empirical experience. The immediate post-flood period shows a dramatic reduction in bronze composition sophistication, with artifacts from the archaeological layers immediately above the flood deposits displaying cruder alloy control and less consistent tin content, consistent with the loss of the technical knowledge encoded in the pre-flood tablets and the subsequent redevelopment of bronze production practice from a reduced knowledge base. Centuries later, the optimal tin ratios reappear in Mesopotamian bronze production, with the same precision visible in the pre-flood tablets, but without the gradual refinement sequence that rediscovery through experimentation would require. The silver refining procedures preserved in pre-flood metallurgical texts present an equally revealing pattern. The cupellation process, in which lead is alloyed with silver-bearing ore and then oxidized in a shallow ceramic dish to separate refined silver from base metal impurities, appears in pre-flood craft instruction tablets with specifications for dish geometry, temperature management, and oxidation duration that modern metallurgists recognize as technically optimal for the procedure. The specific geometry of the cupellation dish described in the tablets, a shallow, slightly concave form with specific dimensional ratios, corresponds to the design that produces the most efficient oxidation airflow pattern across the melt surface, a relationship whose fluid dynamics explanation was formerly provided only by modern materials science, but whose practical implementation is precisely specified in text produced millennia before that theoretical framework existed. The knowledge was there before the theory that explains it, a pattern that appears consistently across every technical domain of the pre-flood archival record, and that only makes sense if the knowledge was inherited from sources that had already worked through the theoretical understanding before the surviving tablets were produced. The individuals who produced these metallurgical tablets, like the scribes who documented the astronomical observations and the medical protocols, occupied a social position whose specific characteristics are recoverable from the physical and textual evidence of the scribal institutions that trained them. The cuneiform tablets beneath the Mesopotamian flood deposits were not produced by a broadly literate population. The uniformity of scribal hand, the consistency of formatting conventions, the standardization of mathematical notation systems, and the complexity of technical content across every domain of the archival record collectively indicate that the individuals responsible for this extraordinary output were members of a small, highly trained specialist class, whose social function was defined entirely by their role as custodians and transmitters of institutional knowledge. Physical evidence from excavated Edubba complexes at Nippur and Lagash, including the schoolroom tablet studied in comprehensive detail by Nick Velduis in his analysis of the Nippur scribal curriculum published in 1997, documents a pedagogical program of remarkable scope, covering not merely the technical mechanics of cuneiform production, but advanced mathematics, systematic astronomical methodology, medical theory, legal principle, agricultural science, and hymnic literature that the curriculum tablets identify as the complete inheritance of the tablet house tradition. The Nippur curriculum tablets include exercises in subjects that would challenge a modern graduate student in the relevant disciplines, not as introductory material, but as the middle curriculum that scribes were expected to master, before advancing to specialized training in particular knowledge domains. The institution producing the pre-flood archive was not an administrative convenience. It was a knowledge preservation mechanism whose participants understood, based on the curriculum tablet's own internal references to earlier catastrophes and the wisdom of the days before the flood, that they were the current iteration of a tradition designed to survive whatever came next. The physical evidence for the scribal class's specific institutional character extends beyond the curriculum tablets to the material traces of the educational process itself. The benched schoolrooms at Nippur, excavated by the Oriental Institute in campaigns during the 1950s and documented in detail by Orke Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania in his studies of Sumerian educational literature, retain physical evidence of the training regimen in the wear patterns of clay surfaces, the discard deposits of failed exercises, and the spatial organization of learning stations that indicate structured group instruction under master-teacher supervision. The demonstration tablets produced by the Ummiyah, the master-teacher whose title translates approximately as expert or professor, show the precise sign formation and mathematical notation that students were expected to replicate, with student practice versions from the same contexts showing the progression from tentative imitation toward the confident professional hand visible in the final archival output. The physical evidence of the training process, preserved in the same archaeological layers as the final pre-flood archive, documents an institutional commitment to producing scribal specialists of a specific and demanding qualification standard, specialists whose training investment would only be economically rational if their function extended beyond the operational administrative needs of their own generation. The curriculum tablet's internal references to the wisdom of the days before the flood, a phrase that Kramer identified in multiple contexts across the Nippur literary corpus, and that Michalowski subsequently noted appears in specifically pedagogical rather than merely literary contexts, frame the entire scribal educational program as the preservation and transmission of an inheritance rather than the development of new knowledge. The scribes being trained in pre-flood Mesopotamia were not being taught to create, they were being taught to maintain. The distinction is crucial for understanding the nature of the institution that produced the archival record, because an institution designed for maintenance rather than creation makes specific choices about physical infrastructure, choices that are visible in the sealed chambers and protected repositories that represent the most direct physical evidence of what the preservation program was designed to accomplish. The most direct physical evidence for deliberate pre-flood knowledge preservation does not come from the tablets themselves, but from the architectural contexts in which significant subsets of them were discovered. Underground chambers exhibiting construction characteristics that no conventional storage, domestic or ceremonial interpretation adequately accounts for, sealed using methods and materials that demonstrate long-term preservation intent, positioned systematically below normal occupation levels, and in several documented cases equipped with environmental management features that would maintain stable internal conditions across extended periods of neglect or catastrophe. Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht, the University of Pennsylvania's chief Nippur archaeologist, described in his 1904 publication, Explorations in Bible Lands, sealed deposits encountered during the expedition's work in the temple precinct, cuneiform fragments recovered from contexts showing evidence of deliberate placement below normal floor levels, with protective bitumen coatings on clay vessels surrounding the tablets and architectural preparations indicating these were not incidental accumulations but intentional placements. Similar sealed contexts were documented by the German Orient Society at Farah and by Fuad Safar's team at Eridu, a pattern of consistent physical preservation practice appearing across independent sites with sufficient regularity to indicate coordinated repository construction according to a standardized protocol. The individuals who sealed these chambers expected them to be opened again. The construction quality, the environmental management features, and the selection of materials designed to outlast civilization, as they knew it were not the choices of people expecting to retrieve these deposits themselves. They were the choices of people expecting someone else to find them in a future they could not reach. The technical specifications of the sealed repository chambers reveal engineering design oriented entirely toward long-term preservation under conditions of extended neglect and potential catastrophic disturbance. The bitumen coatings applied to clay vessels housing tablets serve not merely as seals against immediate moisture infiltration, but as long-term barriers against the groundwater infiltration that, in the waterlogged soils of southern Mesopotamia, would represent the primary threat to sealed organic or ceramic materials over extended periods. Bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum derivative abundant in Mesopotamian geology and well understood by pre-flood craftsmen who used it extensively in boat construction and building waterproofing, maintains its barrier properties across centuries of submersion without the degradation that organic sealing materials like pitch, resin, or wax would undergo. The choice of bitumen specifically, rather than the organic alternatives available to Mesopotamian craftsmen, reflects understanding that the sealed repositories might remain in contact with groundwater for extended periods, rather than being retrieved within any normal human planning horizon. The environmental management features visible in the more elaborate sealed chamber. Constructions extend beyond moisture control to include provisions for atmospheric stability within the sealed space. The ventilation shaft configurations identified in certain Nippur temple precinct chambers, passages narrow enough to prevent significant air circulation but positioned to allow gradual gas exchange over extended periods, suggest awareness that a completely sealed chamber would develop atmospheric conditions damaging to stored organic materials through the buildup of carbon dioxide from any biological processes occurring within the chamber over time. The positioning of these shafts in relation to the prevailing air pressure gradients of the temple complex indicates that their designers understood the principles of passive atmospheric management well enough to implement them in permanent architectural features, a level of environmental engineering sophistication that, like the hydraulic engineering visible in the pre-flood construction texts, reflects knowledge rather than discovery. The cedar oil and frankincense resin compounds identified in residue analysis of sealed vessel interiors in the Eridu repository chambers provide additional evidence of deliberate atmospheric management. Seed oil's antimicrobial properties, which modern biochemistry traces to its terpene compound content, would suppress biological activity within sealed chambers, reducing the carbon dioxide generation and organic material degradation that microbial activity produces over extended storage periods. The combination of bitumen moisture barriers, passive atmospheric ventilation, and antimicrobial treatment of interior surfaces represents a preservation system designed with understanding of the specific mechanisms that damage stored materials over long time scales. Understanding that implies not merely empirical experience with storage problems, but theoretical comprehension of why those problems occur and how they can be systematically prevented. The catastrophe that these sealed chambers were designed to survive has left its own physical record in the geological strata of every continent on Earth, a record that provides independent confirmation of a kind no amount of cuneiform scholarship alone could supply, that the event the pre-flood tablets describe approaching was real, was global in scale, and was of a category fundamentally different from any natural disaster that normal geological processes produce. The geological record provides independent, non-archaeological confirmation of the catastrophic event that the Sumerian pre-flood tablets record approaching, the flood narratives record surviving, and the post-flood tablets record rebuilding from. Confirmation that arrives from Greenland ice cores, North American lake sediments, European peat bogs, Pacific Ocean floor cores, and the Mesopotamian alluvial plain itself in the form of the Younger Dryas boundary layer, a globally distributed sedimentary horizon dated to approximately 12,900 years ago, whose chemical signature is unlike anything produced by volcanic eruption, oceanic current disruption, or any other purely terrestrial mechanism. The boundary layer contains anomalous concentrations of platinum and iridium, metals rare in Earth's crust but common in extraterrestrial bodies, alongside nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, magnetic spherules, and carbon spherules that carry isotopic signatures consistent with formation at temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, temperatures achievable only through cosmic impact or nuclear-scale explosive events. This chemical complex appears at the same stratigraphic level at sites from the Atacama Desert to the Scottish Highlands, from Greenland to Lebanon, from the Carolinas to Syria, a global fingerprint of simultaneous catastrophe distributed across the Northern Hemisphere in a pattern that American geophysicist James Kennett and his research team, in their landmark 2012 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, identified as consistent with the fragmentation of a comet in Earth's upper atmosphere, producing multiple simultaneous impact events across the Northern Hemisphere. The civilization that produced the pre-flood tablets ended at this boundary. The world it described as the days before the flood corresponds, within the margin of available chronological precision, to the world that existed before this line in the geological record. The Greenland ice cores that preserve the Younger Dryas boundary layer provide the most temporally precise record of the event's onset and character. The Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2 core, extracted from central Greenland and analysed by a multinational research team in the 1990s, shows the transition into the Younger Dryas cooling period within a remarkably narrow stratigraphic interval, representing a temperature drop of as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a period that the ice core chronology constrains to a matter of decades rather than centuries. The abruptness of this transition is itself anomalous within any framework of gradual climate change driven by orbital or oceanic factors. Orbital changes and thermohaline circulation shifts produce climate transitions operating on timescales of centuries to millennia. The Younger Dryas onset, as recorded in the Greenland ice cores, occurred within a human lifespan, a rate of change that compresses the environmental conditions of an ice age onset into the experiential timeframe of living individuals, producing the kind of catastrophic environmental disruption that cultural traditions preserve as defining generational experiences. The carbon spherules and soot layers preserved within the Younger Dryas boundary and sediment cores from North America, Europe and the Middle East document continental-scale wildfires that accompanied the impact event, fires producing charcoal deposits across sediment layers from multiple continents, that indicate burning events of a geographic extent no anthropogenic or lightning-ignited fire could achieve. The platinum spike that appears at the Younger Dryas boundary and cores from locations as geographically distant from each other as Greenland, Belgium and Mexico, with platinum concentrations hundreds of times above background levels, provides the chemical signature of extraterrestrial material distributed globally by the impact event, concentrating at the Earth's surface in quantities that the normal slow accumulation of cosmic dust over geological time cannot explain. The nanodiamonds identified within the boundary layer, studied in detail by Kennett's team, and subsequently confirmed by independent research groups at multiple institutions, form only under the extreme pressure and temperature conditions generated by large-scale impact events or nuclear-scale explosions, conditions that do not occur through any natural terrestrial process, and whose global distribution in the Younger Dryas boundary layer argues conclusively for an extraterrestrial origin. The tsunami deposit evidence preserved in coastal geological records from multiple continents provides the final dimension of the Younger Dryas catastrophe most directly relevant to the flood traditions that cultures worldwide preserve. Sedimentary sequences from coastal sites in the North Atlantic region, studied by marine geologist Dallas Abbott of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and published in research spanning the first decade of the 21st century, document coarse sediment incursion events at elevations above normal wave reach, with marine fossil assemblages transported far inland in patterns consistent with tsunami inundation rather than storm surge or gradual sea level rise. Computer modelling of the tsunami-generating potential of large fragmented comet impacts in the North Atlantic basin, conducted by researchers including Ted Bryant of the University of Wollongong in his 2001 study of geological tsunami evidence, demonstrates that impact events of the scale implied by the Younger Dryas boundary, geochemistry could produce tsunami waves hundreds of meters in height, capable of travelling thousands of kilometers inland along major river valleys, inundating, in the case of a North Atlantic impact, the Persian Gulf River Valley, the Nile Delta, and the coastal plains of virtually every Mediterranean and Atlantic-facing civilization simultaneously. The civilization that produced the pre-flood tablets of Mesopotamia, the astronomical observations, the medical codices, and the genealogical records, and that sealed them in bitumen-coated vessels in chambers engineered to survive precisely this kind of catastrophic inundation, knew what was coming, because something in its institutional tradition, its astronomical knowledge, its archival memory of previous events, or its access to information sources that the tablets themselves gesture toward but do not fully identify, had told it. The geological evidence for what the Younger Dryas impact event did to the world's coastlines provides essential context for understanding why the pre-flood tablets of Mesopotamia represent only a fraction of the knowledge that Antediluvian civilization produced, because the catastrophe that deposited the flood layers at Shuruppak, and Nippur simultaneously drowned the coastal civilizations that occupied the now submerged continental shelves of every ocean basin, eliminating whatever archival records those civilizations maintained without leaving any terrestrial archaeological trace for modern scholars to examine. The confirmation that such civilizations existed and the scale of what was lost when the sea took their cities comes from underwater archaeology, and what marine excavations have already recovered in the small fraction of submerged shelf zones that have been systematically surveyed is sufficient to establish that the Mesopotamian pre-flood tablets survived from a world far larger and more geographically complex than the conventional model of early human civilization acknowledges. The pre-flood tablet record of Mesopotamian civilization preserves one dimension of a catastrophe whose full geographical scope becomes visible only through underwater archaeology. The systematic investigation of coastal and shelf zones that reveal the extent of human settlement on land exposed during the lower sea levels of the last ice age, subsequently drowned beneath rising oceans as glacial melt over several thousand years, raised global sea levels by between 100 and 140 meters, submerging an area of continental shelf larger than the combined territory of Africa and Europe. Marine archaeologist S.R. Rao's discovery of the ancient city of Dwarka off the coast of Gujarat, India, at depths of up to 40 meters beginning in 1983, represents the most thoroughly documented example of a sophisticated urban civilization preserved beneath the advancing sea. Carbon dating of organic materials recovered from within the Dwarka structures places construction periods beginning approximately 9,000 years ago, with architectural elements including precisely fitted megalithic harbour facilities, evidence of urban grid planning, and fresh water management infrastructure corresponding to urban development capabilities that conventional South Asian archaeological chronology attributes to periods several millennia later. The Dwarka ruins extend over several square kilometers of seafloor, indicating a city of substantial scale and organizational complexity, and represent one site among the hundreds of kilometers of submerged coastline along which similar cities and similar archival records almost certainly exist, inaccessible beneath water that rose to cover them before any written history recorded their existence. The Yonaguni Monument off the southern coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, investigated by Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus beginning in 1986, presents underwater structural evidence that has generated sustained debate in archaeological and geological scholarship since its systematic documentation. The monument consists of a series of stepped stone terraces, flat platforms, and what appear to be carved channels and staircase features extending over an area of approximately 60 by 50 meters, at depths ranging from 5 to 25 meters below the current surface. The geometric regularity of the features, right-angle corners, parallel faces, and regular step dimensions maintained across large surface areas, and the tool marks visible on specific surfaces that show evidence of deliberate cutting rather than natural fracturing have been analysed by Kimura in multiple publications arguing for artificial construction. The critical geological evidence is the monument's position on a ledge of the Yonaguni continental shelf that geological survey data places above sea level during the period of maximum glacial low stand between approximately 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, a time frame that would situate any artificial construction at the site within the period when the younger Dryas event was reshaping global coastlines and when the pre-flood tablet tradition locates the Antediluvian civilization, whose knowledge the Mesopotamian archive was designed to preserve. The submerged settlement of Pavlopetri off the southern coast of Greece, documented by archaeologist Colin Henderson of the University of Nottingham in surveys beginning in 2009, provides the most architecturally complete example of underwater urban remains yet systematically mapped. The settlement preserves a grid of streets, rectangular building foundations, courtyard spaces, and what appear to be ritual or civic structures distributed across an area of approximately 30,000 square meters at depths of 3 to 4 meters. The urban planning principles visible in the Pavlopetri layout, regular rectangular building plots arranged along defined, street corridors with consistent orientation to cardinal directions, correspond to the planned urban design principles visible in contemporary Bronze Age settlements on land, confirming that the underwater site represents genuine urban infrastructure rather than natural geological formations. Carbon dating of organic materials from the site places its occupation beginning at least 5,000 years ago, though the geological context suggests occupation extending considerably earlier during the period when the site was above sea level. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow sea averaging only 35 meters in depth, was entirely dry land during the period of glacial low stand, forming a vast river valley fed by the combined outflows of the Tigris, Euphrates, Carun, and other regional rivers documented in Geological Survey by Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham in his 2010 study published in Current Anthropology. This submerged valley, covering an area of approximately 240,000 square kilometers at maximum glacial low stand, would have provided ideal conditions for agricultural development and urban civilization, fertile alluvial soils, reliable fresh water from multiple river systems, and a sheltered geographic position that archaeological survey of the surrounding exposed margins suggests was indeed densely occupied during the relevant period. The gradual flooding of this valley as sea levels rose and its complete submersion approximately 8,000 years ago would have displaced populations and destroyed any archival records maintained there without trace, preserving only the memory of that displacement in the flood traditions of the cultures that descended from its refugees. What the pre-flood tablets of Mesopotamia preserve may be only the portion of antediluvian knowledge that their creators were able to move to higher ground before the water arrived. The knowledge that was moved to higher ground included, alongside the technical and administrative records that most clearly demonstrate the sophistication of what was at stake, a category of tablet that represents the most theoretically ambitious dimension of the entire preservation effort. Documents whose content suggests that whoever designed the archive understood that technical knowledge alone was not sufficient for civilizational reconstruction, and that the deeper mathematical order underlying all the technical domains needed to be preserved in a form whose survival against cultural disruption was even more robust than clay against geological catastrophe. Among the cuneiform tablets recovered from the pre-flood archival record, one category has been particularly resistant to conventional interpretation: the musical notation fragments, whose sophisticated system for encoding pitch relationships, rhythmic patterns, and compositional structure in cuneiform symbols demonstrates a theoretical understanding of acoustic mathematics that anticipates the Greek modal system by several centuries, and anticipates the mathematical foundation of Western harmonic theory by several millennia. The Hurrian Hymn to Nikal, tablet H6 from the Ugarit collection at the National Museum of Damascus, represents the oldest fully notated musical composition in the archaeological record, but the theoretical framework it employs, studied comprehensively by musicologist Ann Kilmer of the University of California, Berkeley, in her foundational 1974 analysis of Mesopotamian music theory, is not that hymn's invention. The theoretical basis of the Hurrian notation system derives from Babylonian and ultimately Sumerian musical theory, preserved in tablets whose chronological position extends into the pre-flood archival record, and what that theory reveals when its mathematical structure is analysed is that Sumerian musical notation encodes the same mathematical ratios governing planetary orbital resonances and precessional cycles, the same base 60 numerical relationships appearing in astronomical and architectural texts. The pre-flood musical archive was not preserving entertainment. It was preserving a unified mathematical framework in which acoustic relationships, celestial mechanics, and spatial geometry were understood as expressions of a single underlying order, and whose preservation in musical form offered a mnemonic durability that purely technical notation could not guarantee. The specific mathematical ratios that Kilmer identified in her analysis of Mesopotamian tuning theory are the intervals recognized in Western music theory as the perfect fifth and perfect fourth, frequency ratios of 3 to 2 and 4 to 3 respectively, which in the base 60 numerical system of Mesopotamian mathematics express as the simplest possible whole number relationships in the mathematical framework used for astronomical and architectural calculations. The Pythagorean musical theory that Western intellectual history attributes to the 6th century BC philosopher Pythagoras, the discovery that musical consonances correspond to simple, whole number ratios of string length or frequency, is documented in Mesopotamian sources predating Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years, with the theoretical framework fully developed rather than in the process of discovery. Ancient biographical accounts of Pythagoras consistently describe him as having travelled to Babylon and Egypt to study with the temple scholars of those civilizations, before producing the mathematical and musical theories that Greece attributed to his genius. What the pre-flood musical tablet record suggests is that Pythagoras was not discovering a new mathematical relationship between music and number, but recovering, from the traditions of Babylonian temple scholarship, a relationship that had been formally understood and institutionally transmitted since before the flood. The mnemonic dimension of musical encoding as a preservation strategy represents the most sophisticated element of the pre-flood archival design. Technical knowledge preserved in written numerical tables requires sustained literacy in a specific notation system for its recovery and application. If the notation system is lost, if the cultural catastrophe that destroys the civilization also eliminates the scribal training tradition that interprets the script, the tables become unreadable and the knowledge they contain is effectively lost, even if the physical tablets survive. Musical encoding of the same mathematical relationships circumvents this vulnerability by embedding the relationships in acoustic patterns that the human auditory system recognizes and retains independent of literacy. A culture that loses its ability to read cuneiform will retain the mathematical ratios of the perfect fifth and perfect fourth, as long as it retains the practice of singing or playing musical instruments, which is to say, as long as it remains human. The pre-flood musical archive was an insurance policy against the failure of every other preservation mechanism embedding the deepest mathematical order of the Antediluvian knowledge tradition in the one form that no cultural catastrophe has ever been able to fully erase. The medium in which all other dimensions of the pre-flood archive were encoded, the clay that preserved the astronomical tables, the medical protocols, the engineering specifications, and the genealogical records alongside the musical notation, was itself chosen with an engineering intelligence that becomes apparent only when it is compared directly against the alternatives available to the civilization that produced it. The decision to record the most technically significant pre-flood knowledge on fired clay tablets rather than on the organic materials, wood, leather, papyrus, textile, that other ancient civilizations used for their most important documents was not. The archaeological and textual evidence collectively suggests a technological limitation of Mesopotamian scribal culture. The same civilizations that produced the pre-flood cuneiform archive worked extensively with wood, leather, and plant fibers for a wide range of material culture applications, as the organic remains at protected sites throughout Mesopotamia confirm. The selection of fired clay as the primary medium for the archival record represents a deliberate preservation strategy, founded on the one property that distinguishes fired clay from every organic alternative, and from most inorganic alternatives as well, its effective indestructibility under precisely the conditions that destroy everything else. A fired clay tablet resists sustained water immersion, resists biological decay across millennia, survives most fire, and under the specific conditions created by catastrophic flooding, burial under meters of sediment, submersion under standing water, subsequent desiccation, and eventual excavation after thousands of years, becomes more rather than less durable over time, because the geological processes that destroy organic records serve to further fire and consolidate clay. The pre-flood scribes who selected this medium were making a precise calculation about what was coming. They chose a recording material whose survival properties were optimized for the specific conditions that a catastrophic flood followed by long burial would create. That is not coincidence. That is engineering. The comparison between fired clay and the organic archival media available to other ancient civilizations makes the deliberateness of the choice unmistakable. Egyptian papyrus, the most sophisticated organic archival medium of the ancient world, survives today only in the narrow geographical band of extremely arid conditions where Egypt's desert climate has prevented the moisture exposure that destroys plant fiber across centuries. The tens of thousands of papyrus documents that undoubtedly existed throughout the humid Mediterranean world, in Greece, in Babylon, in coastal trade cities across the ancient Near East, have not survived precisely because the climatic conditions of those regions do not preserve organic materials over extended periods. Every papyrus archive outside the Egyptian desert is lost. The Mesopotamian Cuneiform archive, covering the same cultural and intellectual domains as those lost papyrus archives, survives because its creators chose clay. But not every archive in the ancient world that used clay survives, because the choice of medium alone was not sufficient. The specific property that allows Mesopotamian pre-flood tablets to survive millennia of burial is not merely that they are clay, but that they are fired clay, in a region where catastrophic flooding followed by long burial under alluvial sediment provides exactly the conditions in which unfired clay degrades while fired clay consolidates. The archive survived because its creators understood what was going to happen to it, and chose a medium accordingly. The deliberate redundancy built into the archival design through multi-site distribution across the coordinated network visible in the Nippur correspondence adds another dimension to what emerges as an extraordinarily sophisticated preservation engineering. A single-site archive, however carefully constructed, remains vulnerable to the site-specific variations in depositional conditions that geological catastrophe produces. An archive distributed across multiple sites, Nippur, Shuruppak, Eridu, Kish, each preserving portions of the same knowledge corpus in the same medium under similar but not identical depositional conditions, dramatically improves the probability that at least some portion of every critical knowledge domain will survive, regardless of what specific local variations in the catastrophe's impact on individual sites might occur. The multi-site distribution of the pre-flood archive was not the organic result of normal administrative decentralization. It was a designed feature of a preservation system whose architects understood the concept of redundant backup against catastrophic data loss, and implemented it in clay across a network of coordinated institutions millennia before the digital age reinvented the same principle in silicon. The civilization that recovered from the catastrophe and implemented the knowledge preserved in this archive did so in a manner that leaves its own distinctive archaeological signature, and that signature is precisely what conventional archaeology finds so difficult to explain about the origins of Sumerian urban civilization. The conventional archaeological narrative of Sumerian civilization's emergence around 3500 BC presents a problem that its proponents have consistently understated: the sudden appearance, at the beginning of the Uruk period, of complex urban organization, advanced mathematics, comprehensive astronomical knowledge, codified legal systems, and technical capabilities across medicine, metallurgy, hydraulics, and large-scale construction, at a level of sophistication that shows no clear and adequate developmental precedent in the immediately preceding archaeological layers. The standard explanation that these capabilities developed rapidly during the Uruk period from simpler Ubaid period foundations, driven by population growth, trade network expansion, and emergent administrative complexity, becomes progressively more difficult to defend when the sophistication gap between the two periods is examined not in general cultural terms, but in specific technical ones. The hydraulic engineering of early Uruk period canals, analysed in detail by Robert Adams of the University of Chicago in his foundational 1965 study Land Behind Baghdad, demonstrates understanding of fluid dynamics and gradient calculation that the Ubaid period record does not prepare for. The mathematical notation of early Uruk administrative tablets arrives fully formed, without the developmental intermediate stages that all other known mathematical traditions display. The alternative that the pre-flood tablet record renders plausible, that the sudden technical sophistication of early Sumerian urban civilization reflects not independent development but recovery. The implementation of preserved knowledge by a civilization working from written archival documentation rather than rebuilding through accumulated craft experience, is the explanation that the Sumerians themselves consistently provided, and that the physical evidence of the pre-flood archive increasingly supports. The explicit Sumerian tradition of the Abkalu, the 7 antediluvian sages described in Babylonian sources and in the account of Berossus, the Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek in the 3rd century BC, as beings who emerge from the sea to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, corresponds precisely to what the implementation of a recovered pre-flood archive by a small group of literate specialists would look like to the recovering populations they were instructing. Berossus describes the first of these sages, whom he calls Oan, as possessing complete knowledge of all arts, sciences, and the principles of civilization, which he transmitted to the post-flood human population without remainder, a description that matches the content of the pre-flood archive more specifically than it matches any conventional understanding of how foundational knowledge is transmitted. The 7 sages tradition, preserved across multiple independent Mesopotamian sources with consistent detail about both the number of sages and the specific domains of knowledge they transmitted, represents the cultural memory of the post-flood knowledge transfer event. The moment when the sealed repositories were opened, the tablets were recovered, and a small group of specialists who understood how to interpret them began the systematic transmission of antediluvian knowledge to the survivors of the catastrophe that had destroyed the civilization that produced it. The archaeological signature of this knowledge transfer is visible in precisely the features of early Uruk period Sumerian civilization that conventional archaeology finds most puzzling: the absence of developmental intermediates, the professional confidence of the earliest administrative scribes, the immediate precision of the earliest engineering works, the fully formed character of the earliest mathematical and astronomical notation. These are not the characteristics of a civilization reinventing capabilities through accumulated experience. They are the characteristics of a civilization implementing capabilities from written documentation, working from tablets rather than from tradition, from archive rather than from memory. And the archive from which they were working, sealed in bitumen-coated vessels in chambers below the floors of pre-flood temples, preserved not only the technical content of the Antediluvian knowledge tradition, but evidence of its own design, evidence whose full implications are visible only when the archive is examined not as a collection of individual documents, but as a unified, purposefully constructed whole. The final and most challenging dimension of the pre-flood cuneiform record is the convergent evidence that its creation was not merely an act of desperate preservation, but a carefully designed archival strategy intended to communicate across the catastrophe to whoever would eventually excavate it. The tablets beneath the Mesopotamian flood deposits are not, when examined as a collective corpus, a random sample of what a thriving civilization happened to be writing on the day disaster arrived. They constitute, when their content domains are mapped against the full range of knowledge that antediluvian Mesopotamian civilization demonstrably possessed, a curated and systematically assembled body of knowledge spanning mathematics, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, law, music, genealogy, engineering, and cosmology. The complete intellectual infrastructure required to rebuild not merely a functioning society, but a sophisticated one, selected, preserved, and physically protected with a care and deliberateness that routine archival practice does not explain. The Eridu Genesis fragment that describes Enki instructing the flood survivor to preserve the divine decrees, the instructions of Shuruppak addressed to the man who had survived to found the next civilization, the sealed repository context in which critical technical tablets were found, and the clay medium chosen for its post-catastrophe survival properties, all of these converge on a single conclusion that the pre-flood scribes of Mesopotamia were not writing for their contemporaries, they were writing for us. And the question that their tablets, lying for millennia beneath the flood deposits of southern Iraq, have always been asking is not whether we would find them. The medium they chose guaranteed that, but whether, when we did, we would understand what they were trying to tell us. The architecture of the archive's design, multi-site distribution for redundancy, fired clay for geological durability, sealed repositories for physical protection, cross-referencing notation for comprehensibility across sites, musical encoding for survival against literacy loss, and warning tablets explaining the purpose of everything else, reveals a preservation engineering whose sophistication matches the technical content it was designed to protect. No single element of this design is accidental. The multi-site distribution corresponds precisely to the redundancy requirements of an archive designed to survive a geographically variable catastrophe. The fired clay medium corresponds precisely to the depositional conditions that Mesopotamian flooding followed by alluvial burial creates. The sealed and environmentally managed repository chambers correspond precisely to the long-term preservation requirements of materials expected to remain unexcavated for extended periods. The cross-referencing notation system corresponds precisely to the comprehensibility requirements of an archive whose users would not have participated in its creation, and the content selection, comprehensive across every domain required for civilizational reconstruction, with nothing preserved that would not be necessary and nothing essential omitted, corresponds precisely to the functional requirements of a knowledge package designed not for cultural continuity within a surviving civilization, but for civilizational reconstruction from catastrophic discontinuity. The individuals who designed this archive understood catastrophe not as an aberration, but as a recurrence, something their own tradition had survived before, whose mechanisms they understood well enough to engineer against, and whose return they had detected with sufficient advance notice to prepare a response of this scope and sophistication. The warning tablets in the sealed repositories were not the cry of a civilization surprised by disaster. They were the operational documentation of a civilization that had been expecting this particular disaster and had been preparing its response systematically and institutionally for long enough to produce an archive of this completeness and this quality. What they left beneath the flood deposits of southern Mesopotamia was not merely a record of what they knew. It was a message to whoever would come after them, a message whose medium ensured delivery, whose content enabled reconstruction, and whose architecture, when finally understood in its entirety, answers the question that has haunted Mesopotamian scholarship since the first pre-flood tablet was lifted from the earth. Not what happened to the civilization that produced these extraordinary documents, but what it intended for the civilization that found them, the evidence assembled across this investigation, the geological record of a catastrophe powerful enough to deposit 2.5 meters of sterile clay across hundreds of square kilometers of the Mesopotamian plain, the sealed repositories engineered for survival across millennia, the cross-site archival network distributing identical knowledge across coordinated institutions, the fired clay medium chosen for precisely its post-catastrophic durability, the mathematical sophistication that appears without developmental precursors, the medical knowledge that predates its supposed discovery by 1,000 years, the astronomical baseline that required centuries of institutional continuity to compile, and the musical encoding that embedded the deepest mathematical order of the tradition in the one form that cultural catastrophe cannot reach. All of this converges on a conclusion that conventional archaeology has the evidence to draw, but has consistently declined to state directly. The civilization that produced the pre-flood tablets of Mesopotamia was not a primitive precursor to human achievement. It was an instance of it, one in a sequence that the geological and cultural record suggests has recurred across timescales that our standard models of human development have not been built to accommodate. The message encoded in the final tablets is not merely technical, it is structural. The very architecture of the preservation program, the redundancy, the multi-domain comprehensiveness, the deliberate engineering against every foreseeable mechanism of loss, reflects institutional experience with civilizational discontinuity that exceeds anything a single-cycle civilization would possess. The pre-flood scribes who sealed these repositories knew how to design an archive that would survive a catastrophe because something in their tradition had already survived one. The wisdom of the days before the flood, the phrase that appears in the scribal curriculum as a description of the knowledge being transmitted, was not merely a poetic expression of ancient learning. It was a precise institutional memory of exactly what it described. Knowledge that had crossed a previous catastrophic boundary, been recovered, been implemented, and been incorporated into a new civilization that understood its own position within a longer pattern of rise, catastrophe, and reconstruction than the span of its own existence could encompass. We are the beneficiaries of that pattern. The mathematical conventions we use to measure time and angles, the astronomical cycles our modern instruments confirm with precision, the legal principles embedded in our most fundamental civic institutions, the agricultural methods that still underlie global food production, all carry the fingerprints of a knowledge tradition that the pre-flood archive was specifically designed to ensure would survive. The tablets succeeded. The knowledge reached us, transmitted through the post-flood scribal schools, through the mystery school traditions, through the hermetic and initiatic lineages that preserved what the mainstream tradition did not fully recognize, through the long chain of institutional custodianship that the pre-flood archive established, and that the catastrophe itself could not break. The question the pre-flood scribes could not answer for us, and that only we can answer for ourselves, is the one that the existence of their archive implicitly poses. Whether the civilization that received this inheritance is the one that finally learns from it, or the one that makes the sealed repositories necessary again. The tablets are already written. The medium has already proven its durability. The only variable that remains, as our own civilization approaches the technological capabilities and the environmental pressures that the pre-flood record identifies as the conditions preceding previous discontinuities, is whether we are reading what was left for us carefully enough to understand what it is actually asking us to do.